Our story begins with important things happening in a high castle. The people meekly awaited His Majesty's decision. Emperor Mikhail looked into the eyes of the man who had been sentenced and ordered him to pray. He didn't understand what was being discussed and asked again. Horror and fear were visible on his face. Everyone looked at each other, not knowing what His Majesty's verdict would be. The emperor ordered an investigation into Duke Liscarella. While she was rereading the papers, His Majesty looked at her without stopping. She understood that she had a lot of things to do ahead of her, so she needed to make a good schedule. Finally, he made a decision. A reorganization of the Navy was necessary. What they heard greatly surprised everyone present. No one expected such a verdict. In the event of a military conflict with the Kingdom of Tetum, the Empire will be ready to fight back. The townspeople began talking excitedly, discussing the situation. They wanted at least one piece of good news. At least today, the council passed without an execution. Last time, when people saw the Chancellor's head severed for discontent, they became more cautious. In fact, if it weren't for this secretary, the Empire would have fallen long ago. But many still didn't understand what the power was based on. No one understood how a man of humble origin could make such important decisions, from the execution of nobles to the affairs of the imperial family. Perhaps it was because the emperor himself couldn't utter a word. Suddenly, a third man interrupted the two boys' conversation. He told them to speak more quietly or not to discuss such things at all. There were too many prying ears around, and it could lead to trouble. Rumors abound, especially in high society. For example, they say this girl is the only person in the entire empire who understands His Majesty. She's been in her position for too long. She has been in office for 10 years now and may not even realize how much power she wields. Meanwhile, our heroine looked extremely tired. Apparently, the constant overwork had taken its toll. The assistant asked if the girl would like to rest, and in the meantime handed the papers to His Majesty. But she understood that if she didn't keep track of everything herself, the work would be done haphazardly. She couldn't sit idle. The assistant said that he had heard that the girl had been accompanying His Majesty for 10 years and wanted to express his respect to her, but she asked him to talk less and work more. He had important paperwork to do. The guy nodded and said that he would leave them in His Majesty's office. The girl was glad. Walking down the corridor, she finally enjoyed the silence. Suddenly, while she was looking for it, someone intercepted her. It was the emperor himself. She didn't understand why he took her hand, but the feeling of fear was too strong. He looked at her but said nothing. The girl waited for at least some words. However, he only smiled silently, as if he had decided something for himself. Then he suddenly said, "Of course." What exactly he meant was unclear, but she replied that he shouldn't worry if she was well rested. She also added that she brought the papers for review and compiled a list of official representatives. Adriana was astonished that such a young man with such a handsome face was feared not only by the entire empire but by the entire continent. He posed a huge threat to everyone. When he ascended the throne, his reign began with bloodshed. The imperial palace was tarnished and countless nobles were executed. He was called a bloody tyrant. He was ready to do anything to achieve his goals. The most brutal ruler in the history of the empire. Adriana's heart broke every time she had to pronounce someone's sentence. But she couldn't help it. That was her job. However, she hoped that it would all end soon. Finally, the girl decided to speak. She turned to him, and he looked at her with a cold gaze. She had wanted to say this for a long time and finally decided to do so. Adriana announced her intention to resign this year. She apologized for the sudden announcement, but she could no longer work there. The emperor looked surprised. She also added that it was necessary to start looking for a suitable candidate to replace her as soon as possible, otherwise state affairs would be at risk. Suddenly, he hugged her tightly, pressing her to himself. She didn't understand what was happening. She was scared, confused, and, what's more, very embarrassed. Then, the emperor said, "No!" He even insistently asked her not to leave him. These were the first words he spoke confidently and clearly. She didn't understand what it meant. He addressed her by name again, but he didn't have time to say more because the girl suddenly lost consciousness. She felt very ill. He didn't know what to do, but that wasn't the main problem. Even worse, the girl didn't realize when the emperor himself had started speaking. Finally, Adriana woke up. She felt much better. She suddenly sat up abruptly, remembering everything that had happened the day before. Looking around, she saw His Majesty sitting next to her, clearly concerned about her well-being. She tried to find out where he was, but the guy remained silent. He leaned closer, his face close to hers. It seemed the girl had a fever. She couldn't explain what was happening any other way, but if she checked herself, she would understand that everything was fine. Suddenly, the guy turned around and headed for the exit. She tried to call out to him, but he didn't answer. Just before leaving the room, he said that they would discuss everything later. The girl was left alone. She didn't know what to do or what to say. It seemed the situation had gotten completely out of control. She looked out the window, not understanding what to do now. She didn't realize at what point everything had gone wrong. After all, if she hadn't knocked on McCall's door then, she might not have found herself here, in this wonderful place. And it all started a long time ago, 11 years ago. At that time, she was still a child, a commoner, and lived in a small house. She was a good housewife, so she cooked soup for her parents early in the morning. They worked long hours and often didn't get enough sleep. To make their work a little easier, she took care of them. Her parents appreciated her care. Her brother loved cabbage soup, but she only wished him bon appetit. The father asked how Grandma was feeling. The girl replied that she had already brought her food to her room. The mother asked if she would be leaving soon. The girl replied that she was already getting ready. She wished her parents a good day, and they said goodbye to her with a smile. At the market, the vendor greeted Adriana immediately. It seemed like everyone in the local community knew her. 2 other traders asked her if she was heading to the mountains again. The girl confirmed that she was. They asked if she was looking for the very medicine for her grandmother that she went to the mountains for every morning. Adriana replied that it was nothing, because only she could help her family. One of the women admitted that she envied her parents. They had such a wonderful daughter. She couldn't say the same about her own. The girl wanted to collect as many medicinal herbs as possible. If she succeeded in this, the family would be happy. With this thought, she set off further, higher and higher into the mountains. A heavy downpour began, but she continued searching. It was cold. The cold penetrated to her bones. Her hands were completely frozen and there was no way to warm them. She hadn't expected the day to be so harsh, and it was still too early to go home. Sad. She only found 3 blades of grass. Her parents will be disappointed. She had to hurry and find more herbs, because everything had to work out for her. She concentrated with all her might, realizing that her parents were having a hard time too. If she doesn't find a cure, things will get really bad. But unfortunately, she couldn't find anything. She brought back only 3 blades of grass that she managed to find and apologized for it. Her mother did not scold her, realizing that it was not her fault, and asked her not to apologize. But Adriana didn't know what to do next. Her grandmother's fate was in doubt, and it was now up to her to save her. These herbs were not enough for medicine, so they would have to call a doctor. What was even worse was that there was very little money for a doctor, and this made the girl even more disappointed in herself. Suddenly, she heard something strange in the forest and became very scared. She knew that there were bears in the mountains, but they had never come down into the forest before. A hunter told this story when he found a huge deer carcass with lacerations. This fact scared her, but she was not planning to climb high into the mountains, so she decided that there was nothing to be afraid of. Suddenly, something pounced on her. She braced herself for the worst, but instead saw something very strange. She was scared, but even more surprised. A small boy in expensive clothes stood among the bushes. She couldn't understand how he had gotten there. She tried to ask who he was, but he didn't answer. She wanted to know about his parents, but again received no answer. He didn't answer any of her questions, and Adriana was confused. She thought the boy might be deaf. Meanwhile, he stood motionless, unsure of what to do. Then, the girl tried to explain with gestures that it was dangerous here, and that it would be better for him to leave. She didn't know how to find a common language with him. She didn't understand why the child was in the mountains, but his clothes looked expensive, and he likely came from a wealthy family. She asked if he was in a hurry to get home and if his family knew where he was. She collected only 5 blades of grass, but she knew she had to help the boy get out of here. Her parents would surely understand. After all, they always taught us to help those in trouble. She decided that she would gather more herbs tomorrow, but now they had to leave. She told the boy that it was dangerous here and that they would go home. The guy still remained silent, and then the girl simply took his hand and led him along. The situation worsened. The rain began to intensify, and they needed to hurry. Suddenly, she slipped and hit herself hard. The basket slipped from her hands, and the herbs became wet, becoming unusable as medicine. Adriana felt disappointed in herself, realizing how much she had let her family down. The herbs were crushed, and now the grandmother could have gotten even worse. She couldn't hold back her tears, but suddenly the boy wiped them away with his palm. She didn't understand what was happening, but the boy never said a word. He understood that the situation was extremely difficult, so he lowered his head and simply watched her tears in silence. It looked so cute and even a little funny that it unexpectedly lifted her spirits. She took him by the hands, thanked him, and encouraged, decided to move on. Now she had to concentrate and find her way back, and the boy was just standing behind her. They had fallen from a high mountain, and now it was unclear how to return. Perhaps they should try to climb higher. Suddenly, he grabbed her hand and quietly asked her to be careful. She was surprised because he spoke, although he had not said a word before. The next moment, a huge pile of stones fell on the place where the girl had just stood, which could have crushed her. She was frozen with horror, realizing that she had almost died. In a fit of emotion, she hugged the boy. He had just saved her, and then began to thank him profusely. The guy said he didn't know where the basket was, but now he was more worried about its condition. She asked his name, and then told him hers, Adriana, but the boy remained silent, as if he couldn't bring himself to speak. Then she told him he didn't have to say anything if he didn't want to. However, after a moment, he slowly began to utter words. Suddenly, he uttered one word, dangerous. She didn't understand what he was talking about because there was nothing suspicious around. Suddenly, the boy hugged her tightly. It seemed he just needed a hug. As they stood there, she felt him shiver. He was probably very wet and cold. She asked him if he was cold. Then she took off her cloak and carefully threw it over him. Suddenly, he said, Zarper. This surprised her. She knew the word meant a breed of dog, but she didn't understand why he said it. However, the boy didn't rush to wrap himself in the cloak. Instead, he began to take it off. Adriana, confused by why he was doing this, asked him to put it back on. But instead, he threw the cloak not only over himself, but over her as well, so that they could keep warm together. They sat down and began to think about what to do next, surrounded by a gloomy forest. Adriana found the boy very smart and kind. Suddenly, he answered her, for the first time it seemed. Perhaps no one had ever called him that before. The girl understood his feelings, but could not explain why she herself felt such a strong sense of longing. Suddenly, she noticed something and became very scared. However, then she remembered that she had once seen someone very similar to him. She remembered an argument with her brother. He was very angry about the soup, calling it bland mush. The boy suddenly took the bread from her, saying that she should eat the soup herself, while he would eat the bread. It was her bread and butter, but he didn't care. He said he was going to school, so she shouldn't bother him. Although she hadn't really had breakfast, it didn't seem to bother him. Suddenly, her grandmother called her. She was very scared, so she went to her grandmother and asked what had happened. She replied that it would rain soon. Adriana said that she understood everything and decided to close the window so that nothing would get wet. But her grandmother suddenly started yelling at her. She complained of severe joint pain, and Adriana couldn't understand what had happened. The woman couldn't understand why she was still alive. She'd long wanted to rest in a cemetery because now she felt like a burden. No one could take care of her aching joints. As soon as Adriana heard this, she immediately rushed to her grandmother and began to give her a massage. Although the guy reminded the lady of her relatives, he was completely different. He was not rude to her. So small and kind, he probably behaved well with her. Suddenly, they woke up from a noise. Someone was walking in the forest and loudly calling for Mikhail. She asked if he had run away from home, but the boy remained silent. Adriana couldn't understand why he'd decided to leave his family. They called him Lord, which meant he was of noble birth. Then she asked him point blank if he was a nobleman. He quietly replied, yes. Suddenly, she started calling for rescuers, screaming that they were here. She smiled at him and said that it was time to go home now. She also asked him not to do that again, because his parents were very worried. Adriana watched as everyone fussed around the young gentleman, but then an officer addressed her. He asked her name, and the girl introduced herself as Adriana Woods. The man said that she had saved the young master and expressed his gratitude. She wanted to say goodbye to the boy, but she understood that they would hardly let her. Surprisingly, in a short time, many people gathered to bring him home. They all surrounded the boy, protecting and caring for him. Adriana was upset by this. There was so much care around one child, and her birth family didn't even remember her. Suddenly, Mikhail appeared in front of her. He looked pleased. He handed her something and said the word, grave. The girl was surprised, not understanding what he meant. The boy looked upset. He was not understood. Adriana asked again, maybe he wants it buried in the ground? The knights asked him to return home, but he remained silent. As he got into the carriage, Mikhail turned around and smiled, as if saying goodbye. Adriana waved after him, hoping that everything would be okay with him. She hoped that her parents would be very happy when they found out that she was okay, and that she would be able to sell the little thing her boyfriend gave her for a lot of money. But it seems that she is very dear to him, so she will not tell anyone, and will just go home, because most likely her parents were very worried. She didn't know if they would see each other again. In the following days, she also said goodbye to her parents. They said that most likely they would come much later today. They also asked to accompany her grandmother. Adriana said that she would do everything and wished them a good day. At that time, she was 14 years old. Her grandmother was still sick, and her brother was still preparing for exams. Her parents still leave her to do all the housework, and she can't seem to get out of this routine. Every day the same thing happens. What happened was ingeniously last year. She always kept this dear request with her, and she needed to climb the mountains as soon as possible. And the same brooch reminded her of her meeting with the guy and the fact that it was real. After a long routine work in the forest, she finally finished and could return home. Suddenly, it started raining again. She was merciless because she didn't expect it to rain here either, and she needed to get home quickly. The lightning was very close, so she moved very fast. It was impossible to see anything through the rain, and suddenly lightning struck even closer. The girl was so scared that she even lost her brooch. She picked it up and decided to gather her courage and pull herself together. As soon as she wanted to touch this thing, lightning struck very hard. It seems her hand was injured. I was left with nothing but a lying cake from more. It seems like she's about to die, because she's very badly burned. She didn't understand whether she was sleeping or already dying, because there was no village at all. Maybe she really is dying, but suddenly she realized that she had been dead for a long time. After all, this was the story of the novel she was reading, namely about Adriana Woods, who was the deceased sister of a corrupt nobleman. The family used her even when she was an adult, and eventually she died. She understood that she was now in this body, but she did not want to come to terms with it. She hoped that this was all not true. No matter how much she hoped that it was just a dream, a feeling of bitterness and resentment permeated her very strongly. She didn't want to die, and she made a vow to herself that she wouldn't die, and even though she was forced to indulge her family, she would never die. Meanwhile, he was getting ready to go home. His colleagues did not understand why he was leaving so quickly from here, because his sister works very hard every day, and they asked why he did not help her, but in life he said that he did not need this. Then soon at the academy, while she was getting water from the well, dirty and very tired, her brother hit her and told her to move away. She replied that she needed to wash it off because she had fallen down the hill. Then he asked why she didn't cut her long hair, since she didn't need it at all. He also added that I wasn't very good today, so he wanted something better for dinner. Suddenly, she decided not to indulge him and said that she could not cook something new. And I asked her again if she was sure of what she was saying, and she answered him with a look that she would not do that. The girl replied that she couldn't do that at all and put down the bucket. She said that she was very tired and she felt very bad, so she would go to bed. My brother, was surprised because she was not going to cook anything because she was tired and did not understand what they would eat. It seems he is not at all interested in what condition his sister is in and so on. The girl replied that he should prepare dinner for the family himself. This surprised him so much that he asked if she had lost her mind or if the girl had gone crazy, because he never expected such a reaction. The girl replied that she hoped they would never set up the exam like that, because civil servants wouldn't be smart at all. Most likely, they would just be social parasites. The girl was very angry with him. She understood that he had been using her all this time. Suddenly, she decided that her brother could get some water himself, so she plunged her head into it. I didn't understand what she was doing. The girl smiled and asked if he needed more water. He was very surprised by such a question. It seemed to him that his sister had gone off the rails. It seemed to him that she was completely abnormal. He didn't understand how she dared, and he also threatened to tell her parents everything. But she didn't answer him. She just looked into the distance and sat there until the evening. When she came home, her devastated father asked Adriana what had happened. The girl led her parents into her room and asked what happened. They learned that Adriana had been acting inappropriately with her grandmother, and she had also acted the same way with her brother. They asked Adriana what was happening to her because you can't treat your family like that. The girl apologized. The father replied that she probably doesn't understand because we have a lot, but in adulthood, she will have a lot of difficulties. So sooner or later, each of you faces a difficult period, but one day, everything will fall into place. He stroked the girl on the head and said that everyone has the right to make mistakes, so they forgive her for this and leave her without punishment if she goes to apologize to her brother and grandmother. Suddenly, she replied that she was very tired. Her father did not understand what she said and asked again what she meant, and she started yelling at everyone that she was very tired. It was clear that this situation made me very angry. She burst into tears even more and said that the light rises before dawn and tidies up, which is breakfast before they go to bed. This answer greatly surprised the parents, and the girl continued to lead the authorities into the mountains in search of medicine for her grandmother. And when she comes home, my ungrateful grandmother and brother are waiting for me. My mother couldn't listen to this anymore, so she hugged her daughter, realizing how hard it was for me. She said that she was very sorry that everything was happening this way, and at that moment, the main character realized that her parents could understand her, at least her mother for sure. The girl wiped away her tears and said that everything was fine, and her mother said that she was very glad to hear this. Well, after these warm words, I asked her to apologize to her brother. This destroyed her even more inside. It shocked her so much that she immediately changed her facial expression. Mom asked because of what was left for us. Mom added that she thought that she had at least grown up a little and changed, but she was very mistaken. Father said that he had spoken and that everything would be like this. Her father ordered her to immediately apologize to her family, especially her brother. The main character stood there in tears. I don't know what I'm doing, but my father added that she's not a child at all and life is not as simple as she thinks. Adriana suddenly remembered how her mother loved to tell her friends how good her daughter was. At the time, it seemed like a display of pride, but now it became clear. It was all an insincere game, a way to control and suppress. She refused to comply. Realizing she didn't have to endure everything, she decided to make it clear. Let her brother at least once experience what she was going through. And she herself would study, despite everyone's threats and protests. This response caused a storm. The parents grew even more angry, accusing Adriana of rudeness. They felt she had violated the established order, encroached on their authority, and abandoned the upbringing they had thought sufficient. The conversation escalated into a full-blown argument. Containing her anger, the girl asked, would there ever be a single decision in this house made for her? Her words were full of pain, but they reflected everything she'd long felt inside. Her father looked at her with surprise and irritation. He said he didn't recognize his own daughter and couldn't understand where she got all this from. And then he announced a punishment, not wanting to get into it. Then Adriana asked about the medication. After all, she'd climbed the mountains every time, gathering rare herbs and bringing them back in abundance. But no matter how much she brought, it was never enough. She'd tried to help, to make someone's life easier, but in the end, she'd only received discontent and reproach. She couldn't resist asking why it all happened, why they lied to her. But her father wouldn't listen. He simply slapped her across the face. Adriana continued, what's the point of herbs if you don't have to go to the mountains anymore, if you don't need them? Her father didn't even understand what she was talking about. He furiously asked her if she was in her right mind. He felt like his daughter was rambling nonsense, talking nonsense he couldn't even comprehend. It wasn't the content that angered him, but the tone. Adriana calmly said that she knew what she was saying and was careful with her words. But this only angered her father even more. He wanted to hit her again because he thought she was pulling his leg with unnecessary nonsense. His mother restrained him. He could barely contain his anger. He shouted that Adriana would be punished and would remain so until she did everything she was told. He didn't want to hear her arguments, only punishment, only control, and silence. Adriana did try to change things and seek a solution to the conflict, but unfortunately, everything proved unsuccessful. Nothing worked. The situation remained difficult and unresolved despite all her efforts. In response to the growing tension, she clenched her fists, her teeth chattering with nervousness. As if trying to deflect guilt, she apologized to her parents, explaining that she must have been out of her mind and simply couldn't control herself. She added that she felt genuine shame for her words and actions, unable to understand what had come over her. Her words were filled with remorse, and she couldn't explain why she had acted as she had, losing all self-confidence. After her confession, her mother approached her, and holding back her emotions, said she was ready to forgive her. However, to do so, she needed to continue working. It wasn't that difficult, and she could correct her mistake through action. Adriana, hearing her mother's words, decided she needed to continue working for her family. She calmly stated that she didn't find it difficult because she loved working for her family and was willing to put in the effort. She didn't add that she also wanted to earn money to pay back her tuition fees. But her mother, noticing her desire, replied that she was too young and needed to focus on household chores rather than financial matters. The young lady, overhearing the remark, explained that she knew Jennifer, despite her young age, had already found work as a maid. She realized how little she had been helping her family and was now determined to do even more. In fact, her father used these medicines not to treat his ailing grandmother, but to sell them. He believed it was a profitable business that would bring him considerable profit, although he didn't care about his grandmother's health. He was delighted to hear such words from his daughter, and at that moment, he suggested she become even more helpful. He said that if she wanted to help, she should do it much better, and he offered his help. The older brother, observing this scene, couldn't help but realize how naive and foolish his sister was acting. He thought she had no idea about real life and its complexities. He, however, felt that she was to blame for everything, even if she didn't realize it. He was convinced that she should have shown more caution and maturity in her actions to avoid similar situations. The next day, Adriana Woods took a job as a maid in the home of the wealthiest family in the province. She decided to help her family in this way, hoping that her efforts would offer at least some hope for improving their situation. The owner of the house, having heard of her hard work and diligence, promised to pay her twice as much as the other maids. Adriana's family was overjoyed by this source of income and anticipated a change in their financial situation. However, a month later, she would have to face the consequences of her decisions, as she decided to disappear after receiving her first paycheck, no longer intending to help her family. This decision was unexpected for everyone. During this time, Adriana gradually settled into the home of Baron Jefferson, who was renowned for his wealth and influence. Her life in the mansion, though difficult to begin with, soon began to improve, and she began to adjust to the new rhythm. The head maid, observing Adriana, noticed that she didn't look like other people her age. She studied her closely, trying to discern what might be hidden behind her appearance and why she seemed so unusual for her age group. Adriana, noticing the head maid's attention, replied that all the women in her family were short. This explanation, it turned out, was enough to prevent the head maid from asking further questions. The head maid, satisfied with the explanation, said that in that case, there wouldn't be such a height-based choice among those working in the house, and suggested Adriana write her name in the appropriate field. This wasn't a problem for the girl, as she had learned to write as a child. It was a contract. It stated that if the girl left before 3 months, there would be no salary. Also, if she runs away from the country, the head maid will make sure that she can no longer return home, so she should keep that in mind. She liked the new girl. It seems she had big plans for her. She ordered another maid to take her where she needed to go, where there was a place. Bad told the people to get ready quickly, because they don't have enough hands. The girl immediately agreed and ran. Ariana was very worried that she would not be accepted here either, because what those girls at the market said turned out to be true. They said that Baron Jefferson would definitely accept her. She added 2 years to her age and it worked, and no one even thought about what she was taking. Beth said that only he would accept little girls like her, even if he really needed maids. But it doesn't matter because the woman was sure that if the young lady wants to work, she will try, because there is also a shortage of hands here, so they took her without a letter of recommendation, despite the fact that this is an aristocratic family. Look, she said that she would try very hard, but she was skeptical, and she said that if people stay here for at least 3 months, then believe her. She was ordered to choose between cleaning and cooking and so on, and she replied that she really liked cooking. She dreamed of working here until she grew up, saved up money, and then opened her own cafe or restaurant. She will be able to learn how to cook different dishes in the kitchen, so it would be great to become a chef, but suddenly my dreams were shattered immediately after the words, "Bad?" She said that the girl will be doing cleaning. The woman also added that they should be clothes, but it's not a fact that it's such a small size that it will be found, so if she finds something, she will give it right away. She threw her into the hall and ordered her to try to hold out here as long as possible. Once in the new room, she noticed a different housekeeper. She greeted her, expecting some answers. The woman introduced herself as Galina and immediately told Adriana to wipe that spot. She also informed the girl that if she finished cleaning, she could rest. The young lady asked where her room was, to which the woman replied that their rooms were on the 4th floor, and she could choose any available bed. It seemed like a great place to her, because she knew how to clean, and if she could hold out here, she would surely get the job she wanted. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace, Sargenet was very angry because he could not talk to the young heir to the throne. He was so angry that he called His Majesty a fool, but the boy replied that even a wall has ears, so one must be careful. Then Sargenet gave them one piece of advice. Find your own path in life and not rely on this fool, because if he continued like this, he might one day lose his head because of the emperor. But the boy was sure that Emperor Mikhail was not a fool, and the teacher replied that only Sargonite thought so. Meanwhile, the guy understood that these were just scientists. He was not given the ability to understand what a bookworm who had never been in business could truly know. He did not understand how a scholar could be such a fool and call His Majesty an idiot when his former master, the emperor's father, was much smarter than anyone else in this country. Proof of this was the fact that he was a relative of the imperial family, lived in prosperity, and had the status of a duke. However, the master and his wife suddenly died of unknown causes, and by order of the emperor, Prince Michael was sent to an estate outside the city, where he lived in secret from everyone. Jorge understood that if the boy had been looked after by an ordinary nanny and not by heartless mercenaries, he would not have become like this. Suddenly, Kyle approached him. He was silent, as always. Then the boy knelt before him, greeted him, and said his name was Jorhelmi, and that he served Prince Antonio. He also informed him that His Majesty the Emperor had ordered the boy brought to the palace. He added that from now on his name would be Mikhail Sonnet, and he would be the crown prince of this empire. But the guy answered only one word, tree. And Jorge did not understand this answer, so he asked again. The young man did not answer, simply repeating the word tree. This situation really angered him. He gathered everyone together and asked why no one had reported anything to him. But he was told that the reports were correct, and, moreover, that they had been sent personally by His Majesty, and then he asked what exactly was written. And then they replied that the letters said that he was doing a great job and that he should continue to work as he was. The guy understood that even if he returned to the past, he would hardly change anything. He came in with a guilty expression on his face and started apologizing for introducing him to that unpleasant guy. He was furious, scolded him, and immediately threw him out. Suddenly, the guy said Adriana's name, and it sounded so strange and out of place that the guy froze, not understanding how he even knew her. Confused, he asked again what exactly the prince meant, since the girl's name should not have appeared in the conversation, especially in such a context. Then the guy, as if on purpose, said Adriana's name even louder, emphasizing its importance, as if he deliberately wanted to provoke a reaction and prove something with it. At this time, the main character was busy cleaning when she was suddenly called into the kitchen. There was a shortage of workers, and help was urgently needed, so she hurried. The long-awaited opportunity had finally arrived. Working in the kitchen had been her dream, and now that she'd been called there, she felt almost victorious and elated inside. The butler sternly ordered her to drop everything and immediately prepare for her new job. The girl thanked her demurely and immediately went to change, slightly nervous. A week had passed since the day she appeared in this house, and during this time small changes began to occur in the atmosphere and in her own life. The butler reminded her once again that she needed to wash her hands thoroughly before work, as cleanliness, especially in the kitchen, should be an unshakable rule for everyone. She was over the moon, not only because she had gotten into the kitchen, but also because she had found a common language with the other maids, feeling like she was part of the team and needed. She couldn't wait to share her joy, so she told another maid that she was now working in the kitchen. The other maid was delighted and gave her some suitable work clothes. The military lady hadn't changed at all. She just did as much as she could and kept coming up to ask where else she could clean, because even the senior cleaner couldn't find fault with anything. She didn't even show half of her skills, but the girl aroused admiration in the surrounding maids. She tried to avoid praise, even though it turned out to be sincere. In the past, she was so blinded by the praise of her relatives that she could not understand what was happening. But these words were honest. Bet, instead of praise, gave her a gift. And this was only the beginning. She wanted to learn to cook well and sell food to earn a lot of money. She understood that here she could learn everything there was to know. The young emperor's subordinates understood what the boy was talking about. It was Adriana, the same girl with red hair. He asked the guy if it was about her. After all, it was she who found him, and the guy answered, Adriana. He didn't say anything else. The subordinate asked if the guy wanted to see her. He was incredibly happy because this was the first word he finally understood. He decided that he would find her no matter what. The first thing the head cook asked our heroine was why she was so thin. It seemed our girl had heard this question somewhere before. Sophia wasn't sure the girl could handle such rigorous kitchen work, given her fragile frame. She asked Emily to bring her some apple pie that a neighbor had left over. As soon as the girl saw him, she started drooling. The woman told her to stop looking and sit down to eat. Perhaps she wants to fatten her up and then send her back to cleaning, which is what the girl was most worried about. When she tasted the pie, she immediately felt great pleasure. It was incredibly delicious, and she experienced a range of emotions. It was the first time she had eaten such a delicious pie, but Sophia replied that it was not surprising, since she had made it herself. Sophia shared the secret that only the head maid could taste the pie, to which Adriana asked if there was anything wrong with her eating it. Sophia replied that if she didn't get her fill, there would be no one to work in the kitchen. The lady thanked her and continued eating, but the woman asked her to take her time, as no one would take the pie away from her. In her past life, the protagonist didn't know how to cook, but spent all her money on food. She promised herself that in this life, she would learn to cook deliciously and open a restaurant. And in the meantime, they began to call for the night. The family asked to find their daughter. Everyone cried bitterly and begged to find her. They were making sure that if they found her daughter, they would do anything. Meanwhile, the grandmother kept saying she was supposed to die, and that's when the Emperor's aide realized Adriana Woods had left home. But her father replied that she could not have done such a thing, since she had most likely been deceived by some scoundrel. He asked how a man could say such things, since this wasn't kidnapping or murder. He asked how she had disappeared. The mother, in tears, began to say that the girl loved her family very much and was a kind child. She said she would return the first weekend, but that was exactly a week ago, and nothing had been heard from her since. They reported that she had boarded a carriage heading to Tatu, and suddenly something had happened to her. Masya was very worried, but it was the closest town to the village, and the assistant became thoughtful. He seemed to be beginning to understand what was happening. The family explained how they'd spent all their savings but still couldn't find her. Then the boy asked how old she was. They replied that she was 14. He immediately realized she was too young to work as a servant. Poor people often sell their daughters to other people, and he realized this couple didn't love their child as much as they claimed. Village girls often run away after their first paycheck, unable to cope with the hard work, and this is not surprising. Perhaps these people were looking for Adriana because they missed her and loved her. He saw no point in talking to them any further, so he silently turned and began to leave, despite their pleas. He couldn't understand where this girl could have disappeared to, since all she could do was work as a maid. Perhaps her parents had searched Tatum, and most likely she had fled to another city, or perhaps even the capital. The knight finally vowed to his master that he would not fail him. He felt completely responsible and knew he had to find the girl by any means necessary, no matter what. By this time, Adriana had already finished washing dishes in the kitchen. She'd worked there for a whole month, but had never picked up a knife or touched pie dough. The head cook clearly didn't trust her with such duties. Despite this, Adriana found positives in her job. She enjoyed eating Sophia's meals immensely, and she took her time. She wasn't in a rush, and she savored every moment. The woman again asked her to eat more slowly, reminding her that she could choke. Adriana, caught up in the taste, lost track of time, and Sophia worried for her safety. Sophia couldn't resist asking why Adriana was so eager to work in the kitchen. She honestly admitted that she dreamed of learning to cook. It was important for her to master this skill and understand how to cook for herself. This confirmed her thoughts. Sophia added that the girl must have been upset that she'd never held a knife and couldn't even knead dough. Adriana admitted there was some truth to this. With a slight smile, Adriana explained that she was initially very upset, but those thoughts quickly faded. Now she enjoys delicious food without worrying about not being trusted with such simple tasks. Her words made the woman laugh. Adriana felt a little embarrassed, wondering if she'd said something wrong. She was happy, but she also felt that not everything could be perfect. The woman was surprised that her food was actually so delicious, and Adriana replied that she felt happy when she ate it. Sophia, smiling, said that starting tomorrow, the girl would no longer wash the dishes. Sophia then suggested that Adriana start with easier tasks, like peeling onions or potatoes. She also promised to teach her how to cook, which added to the girl's joy. Adriana's eyes sparkled with happiness. She hadn't expected such news and was overjoyed. It all seemed incredible to her, but she was certain this was the beginning of a new journey. Sophia glanced at the girl and sternly warned her that she would now have to follow all her instructions. The girl agreed without hesitation, as she had long dreamed of learning everything as Sophia could, and was willing to work hard to achieve it. Meanwhile, Baron Jefferson's friend Oleg came to visit him, and the Baron realized that in this situation, he had no choice but to rely on his maids, hoping that they would work more diligently. The Baron's wife reported that His Majesty would arrive late, and now that everything was calm, it was time to start training the maids, because they clearly had not shown due diligence in their work. The Baron was not at all happy with the state of affairs and realized that now he and his wife would have to train these ignorant maids themselves, since there was no one among the servants whom they could trust. After his brother's death, the Baron inherited the title and, it seemed, would now enjoy the full luxury of an aristocrat's life. Despite this, he was never invited to any important social events, and certainly not to a ball. Meeting these high-ranking guests could have been his only chance, but the Baron didn't yet know what awaited him. The next morning, all the maids gathered around the table to eat, and though it was an ordinary moment of the day, there was a strange atmosphere in the air. Every room seemed to have a special feel, as if something important was about to happen. Suddenly, one of the maids approached Sophia and informed her that they had been tasked with preparing the table for dinner. Sophia, listening with interest to the request, immediately realized that this was no ordinary dinner, but preparation for something more important. This news truly delighted the woman, as it meant that special guests were likely coming, and the preparations for such a dinner would be particularly special. She immediately began thinking about how best to organize everything. Soon it became known that Sir Jorge, His Majesty's attendant, would be arriving. This surprised everyone, as his visit was completely unexpected. Everyone thought he wasn't expected until the following week. Adriana Woods easily recognized the man standing before her. Sir Jorge was familiar. His name was associated with important events and familiar people from her past. Jorge was one of the closest confidants to the most cruel and ruthless tyrant in history. Jorge was cold, which gave his personality an even darker hue. Amidst a brutal struggle for the throne, all of the emperor's heirs perished, and the throne was assumed by Crown Prince Mikhail Sonnet de France, an orphan and relative of the emperor. Sir Jorge was the only one who remained loyal to the prince, and Mikhail heeded his advice in everything. However, shortly before the prince's coming of age, the current emperor died, and Mikhail, upon ascending to the throne, began to lose his mind. Therefore, only Sir Jorge could stop the cruel emperor. Thanks to his advice, Mikhail commuted the death sentence to a long prison sentence. But later he was killed, and no one could hold back Emperor Mikhail. One day, when the emperor himself was killed, the girl remembered that the boy had the same name. It was strange that the aristocrat and the tyrant had the same name. However, she did not understand why the emperor's confidant was heading here. Perhaps nothing would happen since she was just a kitchen maid, but so far everything was fine. Her character would only show after the coronation. Meanwhile, Sir Jorge arrived to see the Baron. The lady was sure that there was no need to worry as long as she did not catch the assistant's eye. At this point, Jorge was overjoyed, having quickly found the girl. All a 14-year-old village girl could do in the capital was serve as a servant. He checked the houses where the hearing was lacking and soon found her, but he still had to maintain order and bring her to the palace, lest she harm the princess. Baron Jefferson would be perfect for this. If he offers him connections to high society, it would be entirely possible to present the maids as distant relatives. Then appointing Adriana Woods as an official servant at the palace would be a no-brainer, and he would finally have the chance to satisfy the prince's desire. Meanwhile, all the maids were working hard in the kitchen, out of reach of the helpers. They kept stirring, stoking the fire as high as possible, so as to be ready in time for the helpers' arrival. The kitchen was in full swing, while our heroine worked diligently. It was the first time she had been so busy in the kitchen, peeling potatoes with complete care and concentration. Usually, when high-ranking guests are expected, advance notice is given. But today, a man from the imperial court is arriving, and without warning, no less. It all seems very strange. The girl knew that she was just a doll in this game, but she couldn't understand whether the situation was so serious that she had to come to the Baron for a visit. Suddenly, Sophia heard terrible news that shook her to the core. Confused, she realized the situation could have become a real catastrophe. One of the maids arrived with important information. There was no silverware. This news came as a real shock to everyone. It's hard to remain calm in moments like these. Silverware isn't just tableware. It's reserved for the most distinguished guests, and its absence was a warning sign. It didn't bode well. Sophia, worried, decided that Emily should inform the lady about this, but the girl said that the lady was busy now because she was receiving an important guest, Sir Jorge. Sophia, unable to contain herself, replied that Emily didn't understand the mistress's character. If she didn't report the missing dishes immediately, the mistress would not only punish everyone but also send them off to search for the silver. Emily panicked. The thought of being sent naked to search for silver made her worried that she would be punished for her failure. However, Sophia assured her that this would not happen in front of Sir Jorge and insisted that Emily carry out the order immediately. The maid, mustering all her strength, rushed in the indicated direction. The palace had seemed remarkably calm lately, but now they were faced with their first serious problem, which would bring with it unpleasant consequences for everyone. The missing silverware would likely result in the dismissal of the new maids. It was clear to everyone that if the silverware was not found, the consequences would be dire for everyone. Sophia tried to reassure those around her, saying there was no need to worry. She was sure the fire department was well aware of who might have stolen the silver and would take care of it. The head maid couldn't understand how the new girl could stay here for even a month if she couldn't figure out such simple things as ordinary speech. At that moment, the Baron's wife appeared to ask if it was true that the cutlery had gone missing. She looked alarmed, unsure what to do in the situation. The girl confirmed that this was indeed the case, and the woman, clutching her head, said that she did not understand what to do now, having found herself in such an absurd situation. The woman realized that she needed to find the culprit as quickly as possible, otherwise he might escape, and everything would remain unsolved, which would only make the situation worse. Sophia said that if Sir Jorge left, the silverware would already be sold. This put everyone in an awkward position, and she couldn't help but agree. She suggested apologizing to Sir Jorge and finding the culprit, and to do this, she needed to carefully check all the places where the missing dishes could have been hidden. The young lady was very upset. She couldn't imagine how such important things could be so easily overlooked, especially in the presence of an honored guest. The lady agreed, since everyone could have been among them, even though the devices had last been used yesterday. She hoped it wasn't as serious as it seemed. The woman added that Sophia probably doesn't understand the full complexity of the situation, as she doesn't have the proper education to properly assess everything that's happening. Ultimately, she concluded that the incident most likely occurred during a visit. The maids, for their part, were unsure what to do next. Meanwhile, Sophia turned to the cooks in the kitchen, realizing that even though the cutlery was missing, it didn't mean Sir Jorge would refuse the meal. She gave the order to immediately prepare the usual utensils. The protagonist couldn't understand why problems started right when she showed up. Adding to the high-ranking guest's visit, the silver went missing, and she was having trouble keeping her thoughts in order. Everything seemed to be slipping out of her hands. Suddenly, the butler approached her. He called Adriana without explaining what was going on, but his tone was serious, and it made her wary. The lady was completely perplexed, unable to understand what had happened. She hadn't done anything to arouse such suspicion, but she sensed something was wrong. He didn't explain what was happening, but he firmly took her hand. He added that if she argued or told anyone about it, the consequences would be worse. Adriana didn't understand what was happening around her, but at that moment, she felt that she had no choice, and she had to follow him, without even having the opportunity to resist. The butler led Adriana Woods to her master in silence, without a word along the way. The lady felt the tension growing and was already preparing for the worst. The lady began to think that perhaps she was the one suspected of stealing the cutlery, since its disappearance was connected with her presence in that place. Adriana fell to her knees in panic, begging for mercy. She immediately insisted that she had never touched the missing dishes and could not have been involved in the matter. She was next to the cook all this time and asked the gentleman to question her to clarify everything, but he only coldly replied that he had not invited her because of the silverware. The gentleman discovered the brooch that Adriana had hidden in her bed. She couldn't believe it had been found and didn't know how to explain its presence in her room. The brooch was important to her, and she hid it under her mattress for fear of losing it. But now her secret was revealed, and the consequences were yet to be revealed. Adriana quickly denied stealing the brooch. The gentleman didn't believe her words and asked where she got it, trying to find out the truth. Adriana replied that she didn't know who owned the brooch, which made the gentleman smile. He watched her, smiling slightly, as if assessing her words. The gentleman chuckled, noting that she probably genuinely didn't know who the item belonged to. He added that it would be better if she said she simply found it. The lady replied that if she had truly found the brooch, she would have returned it to its owner. She couldn't keep such a valuable thing for herself. It would have been wrong. The gentleman accepted her words, deciding to believe her. A small spark of hope seemed to appear in her eyes, as if she sensed the situation beginning to change. However, the gentleman suddenly said that if the lady told the whole truth, he would believe her. His words were serious, and he clearly expected honesty from her. He was curious about how she could have gotten such a thing. Then she told him how she once helped a man in the forest, not knowing what the consequences would be. This intrigued him, and he added with interest that she had just confessed to her actions. The lady didn't understand what was happening, her thoughts were confused. He asked if she was sure she didn't understand what it was. He looked at her intently, as if expecting her to reveal all the secrets hidden behind her words. She couldn't imagine that this brooch could have fallen into her hands. In her opinion, it definitely wasn't hers, and she was sure she was right. Adriana tried to justify herself, hoping the gentleman had misunderstood her. However, he no longer wanted to listen to her, as if he had decided the truth remained a mystery to him. At that moment, all the maids entered the master's room. Their appearance broke the tense atmosphere, and they looked at the situation with hope that everything would be resolved. The maids decided to vouch for her because they were certain she was innocent. Their confidence and support gave Adriana strength, and she felt a certain protection. Bet confidently added that Adriana wasn't someone capable of crimes like stealing silverware. She knew her well and was confident in her honesty. Bet also stated that she had no idea why Adriana was being questioned. Apparently, she had been lied to, and she didn't understand why she was being questioned. Sophia, as another witness, confirmed Bet's account. She saw Adriana enter her room that night and knew she had nothing to do with the matter. Another maid came to Adriana's defense. She explained that their rooms were adjacent, and if the girl had been acting strangely, she would have noticed. All the maids came to her defense. This was a real surprise for Adriana. She wasn't used to anyone standing by her side in such situations. At this point, the gentleman, having listened to them, declared that the girls could go, since everything had been clarified. He said that they could return to their business, but Adriana's brother, along with the others, objected. He declared that he would return to his duties only after Adriana went with them, as had been decided. Sophia added that the kitchen was clearly short-handed right now, and they couldn't handle the workload without Adriana's help. Her assistance was desperately needed. This statement greatly angered the young man. He demanded that they immediately stop this conversation and return to their seats, threatening everyone for disobedience. The women stood firm and had no intention of leaving without taking the girl with them. Their determination was so strong that they wouldn't let anyone or anything stop them. The man didn't actually do all this for some silverware, as one might think. The reason was much deeper, and it soon became obvious. Then they asked him why he was acting so strangely and irrationally, despite the apparent motivation. He merely remained silent in response, unwilling to reveal the secret. The man instantly recognized the voice and realized with alarm that it was the Emperor's aide himself, Jorge. He was known for his decisiveness and authority. Jorge entered the room like a bolt from the blue, unexpectedly. His presence changed the atmosphere, and everyone immediately sensed that something serious was happening. Parole, hearing this, was terrified and realized he had to be obedient. He immediately began following Jorge's instructions, knowing he wouldn't tolerate any mistakes. The Emperor's aide was certain he was referring to silverware passed down from generation to generation. However, as it turned out, he was very mistaken. The gentleman added that they had important matters to discuss, and it would be best for everyone to send the girls back without further delay. That way, they could return to their duties. The Baron, hearing this, exploded with anger again and shouted at the maids. He ordered them to return to work immediately, without wasting a minute or arguing. As Sophia and Adriana headed to the kitchen, they discussed how much work lay ahead. Then our heroine asked if the woman was interested in what had really happened. Notara laughed, noting that this situation wasn't unique. The girl wasn't the first to be placed in such harsh circumstances. Similar situations had happened before. The woman reported that similar incidents had happened before. Now it was their turn, and no one could truly understand the behavior of these aristocrats. The aristocrats truly had many important matters to attend to, and Adriana intended to help them. Therefore, she needed to return to the task she was here for as soon as possible. The protagonist accepted this proposal, deciding with a smile to continue working as planned. She clearly understood that she needed to move on. In the silence, in the vast surroundings, Jorge couldn't resist asking why the Baron had interrogated the maid. His questions piled up, and his interest only grew. Someone said there was nothing unusual about this. He also noted that at that moment, the Emperor's aide should have been with his wife, not conducting an investigation. However, he replied that he had heard screams and decided to go over and investigate. His concern was justified, and he couldn't ignore the situation. Besides, something truly interesting was unfolding here. Baron was furious because all this had happened because of the maids, who had caused him to miss out on a crucial opportunity. He recounted how a brooch with an imperial design had been found on the bed of one of the maids. This discovery immediately struck him as odd, and he sensed that some secret was hidden there. An ordinary maid would not have had such expensive items, so it is likely that she received them from someone as payment for services or other reward. The unexpected appearance of the Grey Orcus could have been proof of this. His arrival was obviously connected with the brooch. If not for him, the Baron would not have dared to delve into the matter. Perhaps Sir Jorge has uncovered the Baron's lie. If so, he will have to tell the truth, as it will now be impossible to avoid revealing it. Gritting his teeth, the Baron realized he had no choice. He remained silent, unsure of what else to say, and, finally giving in, he placed the object on the table. The Baron, however, revealed that the entire situation had been caused by the brooch. He explained that its presence had prompted him to launch an investigation. Sir Jorge was very surprised because he couldn't understand how this maid could have ended up in such a situation. He didn't know where they could have found this thing. The Baron replied that the brooch belonged to that very same servant. He was certain she had stolen it, so he intended to interrogate her to find out the truth. However, now that doubts had arisen, the Baron admitted that she was most likely innocent. He decided to ask the Emperor's aide how he felt about the matter. The Baron soon decided to get down to business and ask directly what the Emperor's great aide needed from a mere Baron. He had an important matter to discuss, but without wasting any time, he immediately proposed a deal. The Baron was determined and wanted clarity on this matter as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the maids continued their work, but their mood was clearly good. They chatted with one another, creating an atmosphere of ease and goodwill. The main character was extremely agitated, unsure of what had happened. She didn't know what to do in this situation, but she suspected something was wrong with Sir Jorge. Questions swirled in her head. Should she trust him if she told the truth? And what exactly had really happened? At that moment, she was suddenly called. The butler informed her that Sir Jorge was calling her again. His words were serious, and it seemed important, but Sophia couldn't understand why it was so urgent. Sophia was very surprised, as this had never happened before. It was something new, and she couldn't understand what had caused such a challenge. Wasting no time, Sophia stood up for the girl. She said she wouldn't let her go until she found out what was going on. She was determined to find out the truth. However, the gentleman replied that he himself did not know the reasons for this order. He had simply been tasked with transferring Adriana Woods, and he had carried out the order without full information. He added that if the girl didn't agree to go, he would come down personally. This alarmed Sophia, as she hadn't expected the situation to take such a turn. Mustering all her resolve, the girl clenched her fists and declared that she would go with him herself. She was ready to face what lay ahead. She opened the door and immediately apologized for the intrusion. Her actions were unexpected, but she felt she had to do it despite her fear. Inside, she saw Sir Jorge and the Emperor's aide. The atmosphere was strange and tense, giving her a strong feeling of unease. Sophia froze in the doorway, unsure what to do next. Thoughts raced through her head, and every move seemed too important. On the ferry, they asked her to get on as quickly as possible. The situation was becoming increasingly unusual, and she felt like time was running out. The girl said she had never stolen anything, and no one had incited her to do so. She was trying to prove her innocence, hoping her words would be heard. The Baron didn't let the girl finish, interrupting her mid-sentence. He declared that he didn't believe her words, as it was unlikely that his distant relative would act so vilely and basely. Everything he said only further perplexed the lady. He revealed that Adriana's mother was his third cousin, which added further confusion to her thoughts. The lady couldn't understand why he was saying this, and she didn't seem to believe him. Her surprise grew with every word, but she still couldn't find an explanation for his words. He pointed to Mr. Jorge and said he wanted to take her to his palace as a servant. It was an unexpected and rather strange statement on his part. The Baron explained that although he was a baron, he was still a nobleman. They had the right to be in the palace, but not the authority to be in the prince's immediate vicinity. The lady suddenly realized that the Baron intended to marry her off to a relative and send her to the palace. She didn't understand why he wanted this, and this worried her. The Baron, seemingly oblivious to her confusion, asked her to call him uncle. This gesture further confused her and made her feel trapped. He added that the position in the palace was an honorable one, but ultimately she would die anyway. It sounded like a death sentence, as if her life had already been decided. The Baron declared that she would work diligently, but the other children objected. These words made her feel as if her fate had been decided by someone else, without her participation. She asked him to reconsider his decision. Meanwhile, Jorge was enjoying the moment, unconcerned about the consequences for the girl. The main character asked him to reconsider her decision, as she felt helpless and unsure of her abilities. She was afraid she would only harm her family. She insisted he reconsider. He responded confidently that she had nothing to worry about, as his wife had told him of her excellent abilities and had been observing her. He added that if there was no trust, the maids would hardly have stood up for her, which meant that her approach to the matter was quite reliable and trustworthy. However, the girl did not want to leave, as she enjoyed staying on the estate, working in the kitchen, being close to those she knew and with whom she felt comfortable. She desperately desired special treatment and therefore persistently asked him to reconsider. But he had only one thought in mind: getting rid of her for the sake of his own prestige. He didn't know how much she liked her current position, but he asked her not to act as she had. In his eyes, there was no room for compromise on this matter. He ordered her to stand up. She wanted to say something in response, but he stopped her, telling her to pull herself together and stop saying unnecessary things in this situation. He approached her and, glaring angrily, said he didn't like this whole scene. He was irritated by what was happening, and his patience was quickly wearing thin. The girl had been wrong, and now she realized that despite her pleas, he had no intention of listening. Ultimately, she thanked him for his attention, realizing it was all futile. Jorge realized the decision had been made, and, without wasting any time, asked her if they could leave immediately. He added that her things were already in the carriage ready to go. She was also concerned about the return of the brooch, but the emperor's aide replied that it was too valuable to hand over immediately. He promised that the brooch would be returned upon arrival at the palace. Despite all the circumstances, she still couldn't forget her maids and expressed a desire to at least say goodbye to them before leaving. This was an important moment for her. Unlike her, he was eager to complete the process as quickly as possible. He explained that Mr. Jorge was too busy to waste time on goodbyes and assured her that he would personally deliver her things to the maids. The protagonist realized her situation had changed dramatically. She moved toward the carriage reluctantly, but aware that she was already here, in this place, and could not turn back. Mr. Jorge warned her not to leave the carriage until he gave her permission. His words sounded like a strict order, to be followed without question. She asked if she would go alone, hoping that she could wait for the right moment to escape, but her hopes of freedom became more and more illusory with each question she asked. Mr. Jorge was a master at reading people. He immediately noticed on her face what she was trying to hide. Her intentions didn't escape his notice. She wanted to escape. Despite this, she decided to get out of the situation, saying it would be better for her to go alone. There were only men around, but Jorge immediately replied that no one would pay attention to a maid. She found a way to turn the situation to her advantage, claiming she was now related to Baron Jefferson. If rumors about her began to spread, it could even harm the Baron. Mr. Jorge hit himself on the head. He couldn't understand why he had chosen this particular maid for his trip. His thoughts were filled with questions about his mistake. The lady then asked me to convey to the Baron that this had been a mistake, and that she was not at all suitable for His Highness. She hoped that this would rectify the situation. However, Jorge couldn't fulfill her request. Instead, he agreed with her words, adding that she was completely right, but he couldn't do as she wanted. Jorge said that although she was a distant relative of the Baron, he had personally recognized her. Therefore, it would be inappropriate for a stranger to ride in the same carriage with her, since she was not the prince's maid. The protagonist asked her to go alone, assuring her that this would avoid the worst. He understood that if Sir Jorge or the other servants had gone with her, she would not have dared to escape. The gentleman, concerned about what was happening, asked her to remain calm and not interfere. He believed that this was how she could avoid any unpleasant consequences. He announced that they would rush straight to the palace and insisted that she not even think about escaping. His words were resolute, leaving little hope of freedom. The horses, led by a confident hand, quickly set off, beginning their swift and inexorable run. Everything happened so quickly that the heroine barely had time to react. The pace was so fast that the girl even felt a jolt at the start, not expecting such speed. Everything happened so suddenly that she had no time to react. She couldn't understand why she was still sitting in the carriage. It was also unclear why Sir Jorge was taking her to the castle, since she knew she had to escape as quickly as possible. At the palace, she would still be considered a servant, even though she was related to the Baron. Moreover, her master would soon become the future Tyrant, which only exacerbated the situation. She didn't even have time to realize how quickly they had arrived. Everything happened so quickly that she didn't even have time to comprehend what had happened. But Sir Jorge was already scolding the knights. The heroine's thoughts didn't linger on this moment. She understood that now she needed only one thing: to seize the opportunity and escape without wasting time on reflection. Sir Jorge continued to yell at his subordinates, his voice full of discontent. This gave the heroine an opportunity. She slipped out of the carriage very quietly, hoping not to attract attention. He was apparently angry with his knights, demanding more from them. Meanwhile, the main character seized the opportunity and ran quickly toward the bushes, hoping for cover. Adriana was surprised to see such beauty before her. It was a garden, but too verdant to be considered ordinary. Her gaze was lost among the vegetation. Luckily, there was a place to hide if she encountered the gardener. She could say she was a new servant who had arrived with Baron Jefferson and had gotten lost. She planned to spend the night here and, in the morning, follow the sun to find a way beyond this mysterious place. Everything was to be decided the following morning. Now all she could do was pretend. It was unlikely anyone would be looking for a runaway maid, but it still wouldn't hurt to be careful, especially in a place like this. Suddenly, she realized she had somehow found herself in the very center of a strange labyrinth of green leaves. She didn't know where to go, but her intuition told her to move. Her task now was to hold out until morning. Then she simply had to move toward the rising sun and hope it would lead her to the exit. But first, she needed to somehow escape this labyrinth. The green mass surrounded her on all sides, and the exit was not obvious. She wandered through the labyrinth for a long time, but there was no end in sight. If she screamed, she might be heard, but the air was so stifling that she found it difficult to breathe. Adriana didn't know where to go next, but suddenly she noticed a light shining through the greenery. It was a faint but reassuring glow. She realized that she needed to get to this light, because it could be her chance to get out of this strange and disturbing place. Suddenly, among the greenery, she saw him. Mikhail was standing in a field, holding a flower in his hands, but upon seeing her, he instantly blushed and became deeply embarrassed. Mikhail didn't know how to act when he saw her. He immediately felt shy, as his unexpected encounter with Adriana had taken him by surprise. Everything that was happening seemed like a disturbing dream to the heroine. She couldn't believe it was reality, so strange and unexpected was every moment of their meeting. The boy handed her a bouquet of flowers that could only be found in the mountains, in places where nature itself seemed to create beauty. He seemed confident in his gesture. The heroine thought she understood the meaning of these flowers, but something in the guy's behavior indicated that he knew that their paths would cross again in the future. She couldn't imagine how he could end up in such a restaurant, but the guy confidently answered her that it was all the result of fate, that their meeting was inevitable. At that moment, the girl froze, realizing that everything happening to her was too different from what she expected. Her thoughts were jumbled into a single, unclear picture. But he simply smiled, saying the word fate again. His confidence in the concept made her wonder if perhaps fate really did exist. She couldn't understand what the word meant to him, but somehow it seemed more appropriate for the novel's protagonist than for her own life. Suddenly, her gaze caught a thin trace of blood on her arm. The boy noticed it and, concerned for her health, hurried to bandage her arm. His concern was obvious. The girl, surprised by his actions, asked how he ended up in this garden, since this place belonged to the prince himself. Her question was full of bewilderment and interest. To her surprise, the guy only responded with one word: mosquito. This triggered a ton of thoughts, and she wondered what exactly that answer might mean. And then she suddenly realized that he was using the word as an analogy to mosquitoes that appear unexpectedly and disturb the peace, as if upsetting the balance of a quiet life. The girl realized it was now clear to her. He had entered here secretly. His cryptic words in response to her guesses only added to the intrigue, and he seemed to be playing a game. She realized that he must have been feeling under pressure because, despite his youth, he was forced to cope with difficulties that were beyond the capabilities of a young man. The guy probably had to go through difficulties, but despite this, he was still able to find the positives in the situation, which made his behavior more resilient and optimistic. At one point, the boy handed her a small ball, claiming it was a baby bird. This strange yet sweet offer aroused the girl's curiosity and surprise. She was shocked when she first saw such fruits, but her interest in them was so great that she could not resist the desire to taste them. As soon as she tasted these berries, her heart filled with delight. She couldn't help but fall in love with their extraordinary, delicious flavor. She exclaimed that it was incredibly delicious, to which the guy smiled and said only one word: ant. She found the answer a little odd, but she didn't pay it any mind. Once in the imperial palace, the girl noticed that even the fruits here were different from those in her native land. The boy probably meant that everything here was in abundance, like ants in an anthill. The girl, a little worried, asked if they would be considered criminals if they ate the fruit. The boy calmly replied, "Foam." This reassured the girl, and her doubts were dispelled. Having convinced herself that all her fears were unfounded, she decided that she would enjoy these fruits and eat as many of them as she could, without any restrictions. They had a fun and carefree time until, suddenly, the girl noticed something interesting in the distance, which immediately caught her attention and made her concentrate. Looking more closely, she noticed a narrow path leading toward the exit. This discovery was quite significant for her at the time. She began to think that this path might lead to some secret place, created at the prince's personal command. That's how she interpreted this mysterious discovery. She already assumed that no one would find her tomorrow. But despite this, she was worried and concerned that her absence would raise questions from others. This place would become the future seat of a cruel tyrant's power. The protagonist understood perfectly well that his influence would be enormous. Even if this young man was the descendant of noble aristocrats, he couldn't just wander around without consequences. So she asked if he'd run away again. The guy was silent. His gaze remained indifferent, which immediately made it clear that he had again acted as he had done before, although it did not benefit him. The heroine paused for thought. She herself was no better, having run away in her time. However, she still felt the situation no longer made sense to her. She realized her attitude toward this issue had changed dramatically. She had tolerated it before, but now it was clear she wouldn't tolerate it anymore. Inquiring how long he intended to stay in this place, she realized he'd likely escaped more than once. His behavior had become predictable to her. The guy replied that it was like a hamster wheel, and she replied that a real escape is when you leave forever and not in a place where they can find you. He paused for a few seconds, then said the word unicorn. It was strange, but it also had some meaning for him that she didn't immediately grasp. She couldn't understand why it was so important to him. There was no point in running away and coming back, but she sensed he was different. Having said that if he didn't want to, he didn't have to tell. She added that in any case, everyone's reasons were the same. She understood that many guys ran away for the same reason. The girl met many people like her who, like her, had fled to the capital. Looking at their faces, she heard their stories. They were all searching for their place in this world. All of them, who were close to the heroine, could no longer bear living with their own families. Their suffering was so intense that they decided to flee. The heroine was filled with hatred for her mother, father, and grandmother because she felt they had deceived her. The heroine's family exploited her for their own ends, without regard for her feelings. The boy nearby remained silent, but he seemed deeply sorry for her situation, understanding how difficult it was for her. The heroine told the prince about her treatment at home and how she ran away from her family. She didn't mention her punishment, knowing such details might shock the young boy. Though her words were simple, he seemed ready to console her. Suddenly, the heroine remembered her brooch, which was very important to her. She was deeply worried, not knowing what had happened to it, and her heart was filled with anxiety and worry. She began to apologize, explaining that her brooch had been taken, even though she had carefully hidden it for safekeeping. Her agitation grew as she realized how much the item meant to her. However, suspicious activity soon began in the house when a thief was discovered. All the maid's belongings were checked, and eventually, Baron Jefferson took the brooch. The heroine assumed her brooch was now in Sarahasa. The boy couldn't understand why this had happened, but the heroine explained that it was perfectly logical. The brooch was very expensive, and that's why they took it so carefully. The main character hoped the boy's parents wouldn't be angry with him for giving her the thing. She was worried it could affect his fate. The girl began to apologize to him, worried about losing his trust. She hid the object under the mattress, feeling extremely miserable and helpless at that moment. At that moment, hurt and frightened, she burst into tears in front of him. But the boy, just as he had several years ago, calmly wiped away her tears, offering support without further ado. Afterwards, the girl thanked the boy and smiled, calming down a bit. In response, the boy said the word boomerang, but she didn't quite understand his intention. She couldn't understand what exactly he meant by the brooch and the boomerang. She tried to grasp the meaning, but her thoughts were confused by this incomprehensible word. He continued and said the word smelt, but again she couldn't figure out what he meant. She couldn't figure out what he wanted or what he was thinking. Then the girl suddenly realized that the boy probably wanted to speak with Sir Jorge personally and return the brooch. This was a surprising revelation for her, but she was still confused. She understood that Sir Jorge was not such a simple man as to carry out a task simply at the boy's request. However, he looked confident, as if he knew he could achieve his goal. The girl once again begged him not to ask, assuring him that it wasn't worth the effort and wouldn't bring the desired result. She didn't want him to get into trouble. Suddenly, the guy, without saying a word, took her hand and said the word, "Sparrow." This made her pause, as his actions were becoming increasingly strange and mysterious. She thought that perhaps everything had been right, and that Sir Jorge might not be as dangerous as she thought. Perhaps everything wasn't as complicated as it seemed at first glance. But then came another prince, and at that moment, everything changed. Suddenly the boy was in danger, and the prince might hate him and his parents. The answer was as sure as a unicorn. It meant everything would be fine. The guy seemed absolutely sure of what he was saying. His words sounded so confident that the girl believed him, without any doubts about the future. She agreed with him, but asked him to remember one important rule: don't return the brooch. She didn't think it was necessary, but she couldn't understand why. It felt strange in front of the guy, since he himself had given her the brooch. An interesting thought suddenly popped into her head, one that could possibly change everything in their future actions. The lady decided to ask a strange question. Could she be taken into Michael's house as a servant? She took this step, hoping that everything would work out as planned. She decided to work as a maid in his house because everything was starting to fall into place, as she hoped. There was no longer any doubt in her mind about the correctness of her decision. But the brooch remained crucial evidence. The boy was nervous, worried, and silent. This only confirmed that there was something important about this item. Adriana said she'd found the brooch in the forest because he'd lost it. She wanted to return it to its owner, knowing how important it was to him. If a young man so carelessly lost his belongings, it could be a sign of his high status. Perhaps even the prince himself wouldn't pay any attention to a servant and would allow her to leave without consequences. She decided to ask the guy if it was okay to do so. This question was an important step, and she waited for his answer, deciding what to do next. He remained silent despite her presence. He didn't utter a word, but those around him began to persuade him, trying to change his mind. She explained that although she wasn't a professional, she was good at her job. Moreover, she was confident she would learn quickly and wouldn't cause any unnecessary problems. Suddenly, he smiled unexpectedly and uttered the word, "grapes." The lady didn't immediately understand why he said this and was somewhat puzzled by his remark. Perhaps he really did agree, and her gratitude was expressed in a warm, tight embrace. She felt that he had finally accepted her words. She couldn't resist adding that she sincerely thanked him for his help. He had provided her with significant support, for which she was deeply grateful. Sir Jorge suddenly appeared and, without asking her any questions, inquired what she was doing there. His gaze was wary, and he was clearly displeased about something. His face contorted with anger, and he snapped that she wasn't someone who could touch him freely. He demanded that she back off immediately. In the book, his reputation was far from impeccable. He remained loyal to only one person, the Emperor, and did not tolerate interference from others. He said he had been searching for His Highness for a long time and added that if he had been seeking privacy, he should have let him know in advance. He was ready to accompany him anywhere. However, the boy merely responded with the words, "thin ice." Sir Jorge didn't know how to properly respond to this strange remark and found himself confused. The translation of her words was simple. It was useless. Sir Jorge asked her again and seemed a little frightened by her certainty. The lady, noticing his reaction, hastened to say that she had simply imagined it and would not insist on it any longer. He looked at her carefully and suspiciously, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. His gaze was sharp and full of doubt, for the situation was complex. Suddenly, the lady decided to explain to him, telling him that to better understand, he should imagine himself walking on thin ice. And of course, he would inevitably fall. He couldn't immediately understand what she meant, and then the lady clarified that even if His Highness told him where to go, it always led to strange places. Now he realized that the prince's words had a permanent meaning, but he still had doubts that the girl had not made all this up, and he continued to look for confirmation. Suddenly, the young man pointed his hand at the girl again and uttered the word, "Triana." This meant that she was right, and his words were not mistaken. But Sir Jorge couldn't believe what he was hearing. It sounded completely unbelievable. He couldn't accept the idea that such a thing could actually happen. Adriana was completely confused and didn't understand what the young man was talking about. Everything that was happening left her perplexed, and she didn't know what exactly he meant. Suddenly, Mikkel uttered the short word thorn. It was a kind of signal, a warning for Sir Jorge to be careful, as things could get dangerous. It was an analogy reminiscent of a flower with thorns, outwardly attractive but painful to the touch. Just like in their current situation, they needed to be vigilant. Understanding the meaning of what was said, the knight abruptly threw away his sword, realizing that he should stop further actions and that the situation really required caution. A moment later, he grabbed the girl's hands, looking at her with gratitude, and addressed her as Miss Adriana Woods. He began to express his gratitude. He begged her to stay with Prince Mikhail because she was the first to understand what the prince was saying. This was extremely important, and he couldn't let it slip away. After all, she was the first to truly understand what every word the prince said meant, and this became a decisive moment for their further steps. No one had ever achieved this before, and it surprised even him. The girl didn't expect something like this to happen to her. He added that she shouldn't worry about the difficult work. All she had to do was pay attention to what His Highness said. With her by her side, everything would be much easier. This was a real dilemma for the heroine. She understood that if she stayed nearby, she would find herself in the company of a future tyrant. But both the prince and the knight needed her. She couldn't accept the offer right away. Mikhail was a kind and peaceful boy who hadn't even shown signs of cruelty. But her decision wasn't yet final. However, in the future, he could become a cruel tyrant, willing to do anything for power. She didn't want to be part of that, and suddenly, as if in response to her thoughts, her name rang out. This wasn't a normal call. He seemed to have something important to say. He wasn't the gentle, docile boy she was used to seeing. This surprised her. Besides, he wasn't the gentleman who needed her help. And then again, as if sensing her doubts, the young man said something else, making her pause. The word sounded like a latch, and it seemed like he was smiling. In that moment, she remembered everything. How she had stood at the door and seen him in front of her for the first time. He offered her his hand, helping her out of the forest. At that moment, she realized that her fate had long been tied to this man. The heroine's fate became intertwined with his, even before she realized it. It was as if they had been connected even before they met. The next morning, the girl woke up and couldn't figure out where she was. Everything seemed so strange and new that it took her a while to get her thoughts in order. It suddenly occurred to her that she had agreed to these working conditions. Memories flashed through her mind, and she realized she could no longer go back. She promised herself that no matter what job she did, she would stay in this castle, perhaps as a servant or in some other position. But it wasn't until the next morning that she realized the full gravity of her actions. She couldn't believe she'd agreed to such terms so easily. She felt out of her mind and couldn't understand how she could have agreed to such a thing. It was a strange feeling, as if she'd lost all common sense. Suddenly, someone turned to her and asked if she was okay, if anything hurt. She couldn't understand where all this attention and concern was coming from. This was completely new to her. No one had ever treated her like this before, and she found it difficult to take such attention seriously. Suddenly, she saw a beautiful girl standing next to her, who turned out to be a maid. Her attention was immediately drawn to this figure, although she had barely noticed it before. The woman carefully checked the girl's temperature, noting that she most likely didn't have a fever. She was well aware that the main character had spent time in the garden until late in the evening. This could be the cause of her condition, as she was certainly not feeling well. She then asked if the main character would be having breakfast, to which she was told she would be there soon. Those around her knew the woman had to communicate this as quickly as possible to avoid unnecessary fuss. However, the woman immediately said there was no need to worry. She confidently added that she would bring everything she needed herself and would not force the heroine to do such things. She should be comfortable with this. The protagonist felt that Sir Jorge had no intention of forcing her to perform the duties of a common servant. Perhaps this was because he said that only she could understand the prince and what made him so special. As she watched everything unfold, she realized it would be impossible to refuse his offers or requests. Even if she tried, she couldn't disobey, because it would be against her will. Until now, no one could figure out what exactly he was trying to say. Nikolai remained a mystery to everyone, and his words made no sense. It was obvious he was hiding many secrets. Nicholas was a relative of the emperor, raised as a puppet. His parents had long since passed away, leaving him in the hands of those who decided his fate, leading to his current state. The emperor never showed any interest in little Mikhail's life. Since childhood, he had never met anyone who could understand him, and his hatred only grew with each passing day. The only person he could confide his thoughts to was his faithful assistant. Now the girl began to understand why the boy had gone mad after his death. In any case, the girl was officially employed as a servant in the prince's palace. This allowed her to obtain a more lucrative position than working in the baron's household. Here she could earn much more than in the baron's house. Moreover, Mikhail began to speak much earlier than expected, and after his coronation, he spoke even better. There were only a few years left to hold out. It was unlikely the prince would continue to speak so badly for long. Another 4 or 5 years at most, and he'd reform. She decided to save her salary and open her own restaurant immediately after leaving the palace, as it was difficult to access the kitchen while living next to it. The maids asked the girl whether she would like breakfast in her room or in bed. This surprised her, as this had never happened before, and she was curious. The maid suggested the girl eat in bed, as it would be much more comfortable and pleasant than sitting at the table. She was sure this was the best solution. Right in front of the girl, a multitude of beautiful and appetizing dishes were laid out, not only pleasing to the eye but also whetting the appetite. Their variety immediately caught her attention. Despite such an abundance of food, the girl began to salivate. She couldn't help but admire how delicious everything looked, but it was hard to resist. The girl noted that the chefs likely didn't know her preferences, so they decided to cook everything. This meant she could choose something to suit her taste. Remembering the kitchen, the lady couldn't help but worry about how Sophia and the other maids were feeling. All the commotion was probably her fault, and she felt responsible. She said she loved fruit, white bread, and pies, and asked me to tell her to have a variety of dishes prepared every morning. That was her small wish. As the maid was about to leave to convey her request, the girl asked for some more fresh milk, confident that it would also be a good addition to breakfast. The main character considered this request quite reasonable and even justified. You can never have too much fresh milk, especially in the morning when you crave something healthy. Suddenly, as the girl was pondering this, she noticed Sir Jorge in her bedroom. He looked pleased to see that she hadn't run away yet. His face expressed confidence. But she had no choice. Even if she tried to escape, Sir Jorge would personally turn the entire empire upside down to find her. He was too powerful for her to escape. The boy was glad that she understood his words, and with a light expression on his face he handed her an envelope in which, as he hoped, she would see important documents. When she opened the envelope, she found a contract for a servant, but it wasn't what she thought. The contents were unexpected and gave her pause. As Adriana Woods read the contract, she realized she was facing enormous responsibilities. Among them, only one page concerned the imperial palace. However, the sum was 10 times greater than what she was receiving from Sir Jorge. That's why she immediately decided to sign the documents. But suddenly, she felt a strange uneasiness. Doubts began to arise in her mind, and she decided to pull herself together, because everything seemed extremely suspicious. The nagging question of who she would be here was something she decided to ask. The man she'd pinned her hopes on realized she wasn't as naive as she seemed. His view of her changed when he realized her determination and resourcefulness. Adriana expected an honest answer. She didn't understand what role she would play in this new world and why she had to obey the orders of maids who were foreign to her. He replied that she would be nothing. This statement greatly outraged the girl, as she had expected a completely different attitude from him. His words hit her like a bolt from the blue. Jorge, hearing her indignation, repeated that she would remain a nobody. He didn't know how else to explain it, but the certainty in his words was obvious, and she sensed something more was hidden there. The lady was furious. She couldn't understand the duties she was expected to perform and what it all meant for her future. It baffled her, and it angered her beyond measure. Jorge added that with her background, she couldn't possibly enter the palace. Moreover, she wasn't even fit to be a mere pretend servant, which further humiliated her. Adriana already knew this. But it was Baron Jefferson who orchestrated this spectacle to make her understand how far her position was from what she desired, and even more so, her place here was in question. Adriana always dreamed of being a servant, but in her eyes it was more than just a job. She wanted to be close to Prince Mikhail, to help him and support him in everything he did. However, things weren't so simple. Prince Mikhail didn't consider her role limited to that of a servant. His views on the girl's position surprised her more than she expected. To make matters worse, everyone in the palace, except the prince himself, considered her too beneath her for such a role. They saw her as an idiot, incapable of putting two words together. What she heard disappointed the girl. She couldn't understand why his opinions and statements were perceived as absurd, since he was simply accustomed to expressing his thoughts differently. It made her wonder why everyone was so afraid of the prince. Even Baron Jefferson trembled at the rumors that mentioned his name, which struck her as odd. However, Sir Jorge explained to her that Baron Jefferson was an ordinary country boy who had arrived in the capital only 6 months earlier. His words could not be considered authoritative. It was not customary to speak out loud about the fact that no one could fully understand Prince Mikhail. It concerned the imperial family's reputation, and such discussions could be damaging. People only knew that the prince wasn't very bright, which was always the subject of rumors. At this time, Adriana began to understand how difficult this world was for him. Apparently, the emperor was deeply concerned about the rumors surrounding the prince. He tried to hide Mikhail's mental retardation, but everyone understood that these rumors had already become public. Later, when Mikhail ascends to the throne, there will be no difficulty due to the fact that as a child, he could not express his thoughts properly. Adriana realized that her destiny was her life's mission. From now on, her task was to convey to everyone that Emperor Mikhail was truly very intelligent. After all, only she could do it. A task of such magnitude shouldn't have been entrusted to anyone, not even a maid, since she was supposed to be the connecting link. So she would decide to remain unnoticed. She would become simply a worker, brought here from Sir Jefferson's house, and her role would remain modest. If she understood everything, Jorge asked her to sign the necessary papers. This was an important step in the further process that would determine her future. But the lady objected, saying that in the palace there were not only servants but also ladies-in-waiting, as well as ordinary workers, and her position should be higher. The legend Sir Jefferson had concocted might have enabled her to become a servant, but it was clearly not enough to be a maid of honor. Moreover, to work in the palace she had to wait until she came of age, and before that moment, as she knew, there was still a lot of time left. However, there were other options. Jorge even considered making her the emperor's bride, which would have opened up new prospects for her. Adriana couldn't understand why her brother couldn't marry before ascending the throne. This rule remained a mystery to her, defying explanation. Then Sir Jorge explained to her that such young couples often die very early. This had become a common occurrence, and this was almost always how events unfolded in their world. Adriana began to realize that Sir Jorge was far from the best man, despite his explanations. He'd merely suggested the idea, though he sensed it would be perceived as cruelty by others. Jorge immediately realized this was the right decision, as a bride capable of transforming the prince would become an important figure. However, her life would now be primarily tied to the palace. The habit of communicating with the crown prince gradually influenced Adriana. She began to subconsciously adopt his manner of speech and expression, a process that became natural to her. Jorge was surprised by Adriana's strange remark and asked what she had just said. She wasted no time in replying that the word unicorn, in butler speak, meant impossibility. Adriana's words made Jorge pause. He realized there were many hidden meanings in their conversation that had just become apparent to him, and he felt a new depth. He tried to object but didn't have time to finish. It was on this day that Sarah Jorge vowed to give his life to protect her. She begged to become Prince Kelly's bride but had to stop him. She wore a luxurious dress that stunned everyone with its beauty. She looked absolutely stunning in this outfit, but it evoked conflicting feelings in her soul. The problem was that she couldn't get used to such clothes. Her poor lifestyle didn't allow her to wear such outfits, and she felt uncomfortable in this splendor. The assistant immediately ran to her, noticing her confusion. She asked if everything was all right, and added that it would be best to call a maid to help hold the skirt in place. Adriana calmly replied that nothing terrible had happened. After all, in her opinion, there was no one around, and it didn't matter at all, especially since no one was waiting for her here. The assistant asked doubtfully if it would be possible to choose something simpler, but the maid replied that Sir Jorge wanted her to dress according to her status and follow strict instructions. The main character couldn't understand why so much attention was being paid to her. She couldn't understand why she had to explain everything she did so carefully, since she had no intention of disturbing the peace. Adriana thought for a long time and finally realized that her profession was translation. Although she still couldn't express herself clearly, she knew she had to study and master new skills. Despite her discomfort, the girl had to adjust to her new life. The maid, noticing her confusion, asked if she should bring some of the dessert. Adriana agreed to the offer. She was a little nervous, as she would have to share her thoughts and experiences with other people. She wasn't sure how she would cope. Sir Jorge suddenly appeared and asked if everything was ready. His calm somewhat reassured the girl, and she answered in the affirmative. Then they headed into the hallway. Along the way, she asked Sir Jorge if he could personally translate for people like her. but he didn't understand what she was talking about. She noticed his confusion but didn't continue the conversation. She explained that without him, his charges would be left unprotected. He was the only one who could provide security when they arrived together, and she feared for their safety. The girl declared that the prince was now in danger. Hearing these words, Sir Jorge confidently replied that no one would dare harm the young heir. Adriana didn't understand why everything was so strange. Then Sir Jorge explained that if anyone dared threaten the prince, the person found guilty could be appointed as his replacement. Sir Jorge said such a threat would have serious consequences. If anyone were to harm the prince, the consequences would be so severe that they would not go unpunished. If Prince L had been killed without the emperor's orders, someone would have had to take his place. However, anyone who claimed that role would have been eliminated immediately. To those around him, L seemed like a carefree and foolish man who was unlikely to ever become emperor. Therefore, they weren't particularly concerned about his fate. It would be much more profitable to leave him alone. But if the lady works decently, then perhaps something will change in his position, and the situation will become different. Then, the girl began to worry, because she realized she might not even need to work hard. She could only translate the prince's words for Sir Jorge. But he explained that from the moment the girl appeared, Prince Michael had been in danger, and now his life was at greater risk. However, he couldn't abandon him. The question the protagonist was left with was simple. Why couldn't he leave the prince? It was unclear, but the answer was never given. More questions arose in her mind. Of course, it was a shame the prince was treated like a fool. But, on the other hand, it would have been better if he had simply fled the threat of death before he was ready. He didn't seem to give a clear answer to her questions, and after she heard his words, even more uncertainty arose. He simply asked her to follow him and be quiet. Prince Mikhail probably already has something in mind. He's always been like that, and if it's true, he'll be delighted, as he doesn't like doing anything boring or obligatory. The girl was greatly surprised. The prince's schedule should have included lessons, and she hadn't expected him to be plotting anything. This added to her anxiety. However, this didn't seem important to Jorge. He was willing to ignore such details, considering them insignificant compared to more pressing matters that required his attention. He advised the girl not to worry. She shouldn't expect the prince to inform her of his schedule every day or to accommodate her demands. But after his words, Adriana couldn't understand how she would be able to find him if she needed him. She didn't know how to act in such a situation. The knight suddenly asked her about time. He wondered if she thought time was wasted only on conversation and silence, or if it should be used more effectively. If you think about it, it was more like being awake than asleep. She needed to adapt to the prince's schedule so she could always be ready to help at a moment's notice. Now the girl understood what they were talking about. Jorge wanted her to be there constantly, keeping an eye on everything, not missing a single detail, ready to intervene at any moment. Jorge also answered her question about why he couldn't leave the prince. He explained that Mikhail was upset, no one understood him, and he cried at night, hiding his feelings. What she heard deeply shocked the girl. She realized that the boy she had met had suffered profound emotional trauma. This was clear from his behavior and facial expression. Now before her stood a future tyrant, a man who would march through seas of blood, executing countless people, and it was he, on these nights, who quietly cried into his pillow. She decided to do everything in her power to change his fate. After all, only she could be his voice, help him become a better person, and avoid this terrible fate. She made a promise to herself to change the world. She vowed to do everything in her power to make Mickey's life, and her own, far better than they could have been. Suddenly, she was invited into the hall, and she felt a little uneasy. Expecting something important, she headed toward the place where the one who could change her life was waiting. It was the stern teacher, Professor Schubert. She immediately asked if the person standing before her was Adriana Woods, and the girl felt her heart skip a beat. She was informed that 2 people would be present at the lesson, which greatly surprised the girl. She had never attended the academy and hadn't prepared for classes, but she could read. Once in class, Adriana realized she'd be studying with Mikhail. This came as a surprise, as she hadn't expected her life to change so quickly. The young lady was shocked by what was happening. Professor Schubert wasn't about to waste time getting her used to it. She sternly warned that if Adriana didn't pay attention to the lesson, she would ask her to leave. The girl had no choice, although she knew perfectly well that this was what would happen. Therefore, she had to try to minimize her mistakes so as not to arouse suspicion. Suddenly, the crown prince turned to Adriana. He seemed about to say something, but at the moment of his gesture, she sensed a slight unease and anticipation. Suddenly, The prince uttered the word slippers. It was a sign that he was asking her to relax and not worry so much, which seemed sweet and unusual for him. The gesture meant that the prince wanted her not to worry, and although it was strange, Adriana hoped that her presence might influence his character. Meanwhile, the professor explained that they would be given textbooks that they would have to write themselves. This would become an important part of their future education. She gave the command to open the books. They were de Brent's history textbooks, which were to be studied, but their structure was unusual and required special attention. But it turned out this wasn't an ordinary book at all. They were holding a notebook in which they were supposed to write down everything they learned in class. The notebook was an essential part of their learning process. Here they were required to write down everything they learned, creating a kind of personal memoir for future reference. Then one of the students asked if they would only study history. The professor replied that, of course, there would be many subjects and everyone would make their own contribution. Although the teaching was supposed to be varied, it so happened that the professor agreed to teach them history, politics, and mathematics, considering these topics to be the main ones. 3 subjects was enough to start, and Adriana knew she had a lot of work ahead of her. But she was ready to overcome any difficulties on the path to knowledge. The lesson began, but its content was simply terrible. The unclear and complex topics made the girl feel insecure and angry as she couldn't understand. She couldn't understand a single sentence. This frustrated her, but despite this, she continued to try to concentrate so as not to appear weak in front of the professor. The professor asked the students to write down at least those points they understood. For Adriana, this became another challenge, to make even a small contribution to the entire lesson. The main character, Adriana Woods, couldn't understand what was being said. She replied that she didn't understand a thing, and besides, her memory was failing her at that moment. They then decided to study His Highness's notes. This decision seemed logical, as they could contain vital information that could shed light on everything that had happened. However, the notebook turned out to be less useful than expected. This greatly disappointed the academy professor, who couldn't believe his subjects were being treated so superficially. The professor suggested that perhaps they were simply unaccustomed to taking notes. He suggested they try question and answer sessions to better retain the information. Suddenly, as if in response, Mikkel uttered the word plum. This was his special confirmation because His Highness had always loved this fruit, and it was a kind of approval. This was a real relief for the professor. He was delighted and suggested continuing the lesson. Taking up a pointer, he began to explain the history of the Dobron Empire in detail. The professor explained in detail how the continent had been repeatedly divided into several countries. The protagonist, listening to all this, felt as if she understood nothing, as she had trouble remembering faces and events. The professor also explained that the territories of these countries were very small. Some of them resembled small settlements in area. Yet despite this, they declared themselves separate states. The emperor hailed from a small country that no one particularly noticed. It was as small as many others hidden on the map of the continent. The country was so small that its capital was significantly larger, raising questions about dividing the continent into such tiny states. The lady considered this, but didn't know how to respond. It all seemed to her to make sense, since these strange small states had existed before the empire. At that moment, the boy sitting next to me suddenly uttered the word ankylosis. His voice was quiet but clear, and the word was clearly out of context. This surprised the girl, as she couldn't immediately understand what he meant. The word sounded strange and didn't sound like anything familiar to her. The professor, trying to figure it out, asked him what he meant by that word. But she couldn't understand it because it didn't exist in the language she knew. The boy continued to repeat the word without stopping, but it all remained incomprehensible to her. Each repetition only confused her, failing to provide the necessary explanation. The professor then became very angry. She had hoped that with the young lady's help, she would be able to establish contact with His Highness, but this was not happening, and she became quite upset. Although Adriana had understood something before, her thoughts were now completely confused. She felt broken, unsure of what was happening. The professor, noticing her sadness, decided to intervene. At that moment, the boy turned to Adriana. The professor added that she hoped they wouldn't miss their chance and that the stalking teacher wouldn't be the reason for their failure. This was important to her students, and she hoped the situation wouldn't get out of control. Everything that was happening seemed very complicated and even a little confusing. Adriana couldn't figure out what exactly had gone wrong. Her feelings were mixed, and she didn't know how to proceed. The situation seemed to be getting too tense. Adriana decided to ask again what the word meant. She was well aware that she hadn't understood it the first time, and she wanted to clarify what exactly he meant. This was important for her, so as not to make a mistake. The boy wanted to say something, but his thoughts suddenly became confused and he didn't know how to start the conversation. He seemed a little lost, unsure how to continue. Adriana began to worry that she might have offended him, and immediately tried to rectify the situation. She quickly told him it wasn't his fault, so he wouldn't worry. This worry had overwhelmed her, and she didn't want him to feel awkward. Suddenly, a new figure appeared in the room, and Adriana noticed it. Someone had entered, interrupting their conversation. It was an unexpected turn of events, and she didn't have time to figure out who it was. Sir Jorge entered the room. He looked very agitated and, noticing the tense atmosphere, asked what had happened. He clearly sensed something was wrong and wanted to get to the bottom of it. Adriana started to apologize, but Jorge immediately reassured her, saying there was no need to apologize. He was sure it wasn't anything serious and that the problem could be solved. He didn't want her to worry needlessly. Sir Jorge wanted to understand what the real problem was. He suggested that perhaps Adriana had simply lost the ability to do something, and that this could be the cause of her condition. She replied that she had no abilities. The prince had merely said, "Ankelo you," and she had no idea what that meant. Her response was one of utter bewilderment. The guy might have made the word up himself, and his enigmatic expression left her baffled. She doubted she'd ever heard anything like it. Deeply surprised by her answer, the prince asked if she knew the meaning of the word. He clearly expected a different interpretation, but her answer only confirmed her ignorance. The young lady calmly replied that she had never heard the word before, and it was clear from her face that she did not understand what was being said. Jorge's mind finally clicked, and he began to pay closer attention to her answers. He might have realized something was wrong with what he was hearing. He asked her if she'd ever been to a zoo, to which she replied no. This only piqued his curiosity, and he continued asking questions. She'd heard about the zoo in the capital, but she thought it was too expensive to get there, and she didn't have the time. But the idea itself still appealed to her. Jorge explained that the ankylos was an exotic animal not found in the empire. He noted with surprise that she didn't know this, which seemed perfectly logical. It wouldn't be surprising for her not to know about this animal, but how could the prince know about it? However, the knight had an answer to that question, and he was ready to voice it. They will remain in the palace for about another month, after which they will be returned to the zoo. This decision was made with the participation of the prince, who was very interested. He recalled how much this had intrigued His Highness. His attention had been drawn to this unusual animal, and he had long wanted to learn more about it. It was difficult for the girl to understand, for she couldn't imagine how vastly different their worlds were. What was familiar to him she could barely comprehend. The difference in their situations was too great, and if it wasn't narrowed, such situations could recur. She needed to continue her training. If she doesn't take these steps, her level of assistance will remain too low. Her abilities and knowledge will be limited, preventing her from effectively dealing with difficulties. Then Sir Jorge pulled out his notebook. Even though the drawings weren't the most accurate, at least some of the features were still on the paper, allowing for some understanding. He explained that this was exactly the animal the young prince had spoken of. In reality, its coloring was much brighter and its mouth more menacing than depicted in the drawing. After carefully examining the painting, the girl realized which animal was being depicted. Everything fell into place in her mind, and now she could understand what was hidden behind the words. The professor, when asking her question, was talking about the many small states that had existed in the past. This made the girl think, and she tried to remember why that was. If you look at the back of an ankylosaurus, you'll notice numerous ridges. These features resemble mountain ranges, adding to the animal's massiveness and uniqueness. De Brant was rich in varied landscapes. Although the city was quite large, the surrounding countryside was mountainous, and the girl grew up in such terrain, accustomed to it. Sir Jorge agreed with the girl. He admitted she was right. Before roads were built to transport goods between countries, nothing had been organized. From this, Sir Jorge realized that this was precisely what she meant. He realized that her words reflected the precise state of affairs, and that this was the basis of her entire thinking. Within the empire, territory varied greatly depending on the region. That's why there used to be many small states. This explained a lot, and Sir Jorge understood the need for an apology. She replied that she apologized for her failures in fulfilling her duties, but this greatly surprised the knight. He knew she was doing everything in her power and had no need to make excuses. Jorge asked her to stop talking nonsense. He saw how hard she was trying and thought she was doing a great job, but she thought otherwise because she'd missed class. The girl believed it was all her fault. She burst into tears because even though His Majesty had answered her question, she couldn't understand him and felt like a failure. She tried to explain to the teacher, but there was no point. Professor Schubert had made it clear there was only one chance. If she left, she wouldn't come back. This disappointed the girl even more as she understood how much effort the assistant had put into inviting Professor Schubert. Many teachers had already refused to teach the young man. Now she couldn't figure out who would teach Mikhail, when Sir Jorge suddenly knelt down and suggested he take over the training. He offered his help. Of course, he wasn't sure he could teach as well as the situation required, as his knowledge wasn't nearly as deep. He couldn't help them reach the required level. However, this was temporary, until another teacher could be found. The prince replied that it would be tolerable, although his answers were a bit confusing, such as strawberry. She glanced at the books he'd been given. When she stood in front of them, she realized they were preschool books. This was much better than Professor Schubert's words. She began studying them and found herself deeply intrigued. The books were simple and accessible, allowing her to focus on their contents. The prince was coping with the books beautifully, but it was clear something was bothering him. He looked a little irritated, as if something wasn't quite as he expected. The lady asked what exactly he was unhappy with. The prince replied, "Paper," but his answer was incomplete, and the girl couldn't immediately understand what he meant. Sir Jorge thought the poor quality of the paper might explain his displeasure. However, the prince repeated his words without explaining exactly what he meant. He said paper again, hoping those around him would understand his problem. He was convinced that this word was the key to his discontent. Suddenly, the lady realized that the prince simply couldn't count letters. This became clear to her, and now she understood exactly what the problem with his perception was. She was absolutely certain the young man couldn't read letters, and that explained his strange remarks. He simply couldn't perceive the book the way others did. Jorge was so enraged that his desire to immediately eliminate those teachers who were only pretending to teach Prince Mikhail became almost unbearable. He couldn't allow these people to continue their work. In the book, the knight Jorge was often described as the loyal right-hand man of the cruelest tyrant. However, in reality, his behavior was far from the image of a cool, decisive man who always remained calm. The lady, watching Jorge lash out passionately at those who had failed to live up to his expectations, asked what would happen to the prince if he did kill them. But Jorge wasn't interested in the opinions of those around him. He believed no one would notice. However, she knew for certain that Jorge was not the kind of person capable of acting in such a way. He possessed far more conscious values than might initially appear. He was deeply resentful of himself, as he acknowledged his own guilt. He believed that it was his carelessness and weak judgment that had led to Prince Mikhail never learning to read and write. Jorge felt like an idiot, following the emperor's orders without thinking. He was convinced that this was the only right path, and that only this way could he achieve success, not realizing that his actions could do more harm than good. It didn't even occur to him that his own view of things might be wrong. Jorge thought Prince Mikhail could learn to read and write, but he missed the importance of a human approach to learning. Suddenly, Prince Mikhail himself approached the weeping Jorge. His presence seemed to bring some clarity to this confusing situation, for Mikhail was far wiser than many might have thought. The prince smiled, which was an unexpected and even instructive gesture for Jorge. He said that sunlight always illuminates the darkness, and that nothing is ever completely bad. The girl standing nearby assured him that the prince was truly confident that everything would be fine, and that they would each overcome their difficulties. Her confidence was infectious. These words brought him genuine joy, and he decided that he would now take up teaching them. He was determined to teach them the alphabet as soon as possible. He quickly wiped the tears from his face and, eager to get to work, set to work. His desire to teach the alphabet was strong, and he was ready to begin immediately. She also asked if the knight would mind if she taught Prince Mikhail to read herself. Her request was modest, but very important for the boy's future. As soon as the girl received permission to educate the little emperor, she enthusiastically set about teaching him the alphabet. She carefully wrote out all the letters, and fortunately he quickly mastered the alphabet. His progress became more and more obvious with each passing day, and she was very pleased. She hadn't even expected such rapid progress. Seeing him learn the alphabet in just one day, she began to wonder if he was pretending not to be able to speak. And so, sometime later, he wrote his first essay. In it, he talked about eating a plum, and despite the simplicity of the topic, his thoughts were sincere. What he said next didn't really matter. The protagonist even asked him to rewrite the sentence, and the result remained the same. However, she understood his intention. In the entire empire, there were only two people who supported Mikhail, our heroine and Sir Jorge. Everyone else was only happy when he seemed a fool. However, the heroine was confident that in a few years, Mikhail would learn to speak like a normal person. She understood that if she continued to support him, it might speed up the process. She also announced that classes were over for the day as they had worked so hard. The heroine noted that she would talk to Jorge about inviting another teacher. After all, she couldn't teach him everything, as she didn't know enough herself. It was clear from his expression that this news didn't please him very much. He looked very sad, but the girl confidently added that she would attend all the classes and that he shouldn't worry. The boy, despite his sadness, asked her to swear on her name. With a smile on her face, she took the oath, assuring him that everything would be as they had agreed. To seal their agreement, he suggested a pinky handshake. It was a gesture that symbolized their agreement and mutual trust. They completed all the agreements, but the heroine still had one important duty left. She had to stay by the boy's side while he was awake and take care of him. Adriana Woods signed with Sir Jorge, and this decision opened new horizons for her. She understood that this was a step that would change her life. Hearing this, the boy nearby was overjoyed. His face lit up with joy, and he felt relief fill his heart. The next moment, he ran up and hugged the girl. He missed her presence so much, and he truly enjoyed her company, feeling safe with her. His embrace was so tight that Adriana couldn't even breathe. The boy, seemingly oblivious to her nervousness, continued to hold her in his arms. He wanted her to be with him always, by his side. However, the girl warned him that this was probably impossible, as she didn't know how long people could stay close. The young man, despite his youth, suggested an unusual way to be together, in a coffin. His words about death struck Adriana, as he was only 10 years old, and such thoughts were inappropriate. However, it seemed he hadn't expected his words to provoke such a reaction. The boy simply stared at her silently, unable to comprehend the effect this had on the girl. The same teacher came to the next class. However, Adriana noticed that she seemed a little bolder. This made her feel uneasy. She nervously greeted the teacher, who responded by ordering her to open a new textbook. Adriana realized that another important step in their education awaited them. She recounted hearing that His Highness could now read, and mentioned that they had been having some difficulty communicating. The boy again uttered incomprehensible words, specifically gravel. This meant he agreed. Before the start of the class, the professor made a request of Ms. Wood. She asked her to pay close attention to the professor's lessons and listen attentively to every moment. This surprised the main character, as she hadn't had to do anything like that. His Highness understood everything perfectly, and her role was simply to sit next to him and translate. However, the professor thought otherwise. Even if the boy understood everything, if the lady couldn't correctly interpret his thoughts, she wouldn't be able to accurately convey his feelings and thoughts. This meant that, despite Mikhail's knowledge, Ms. Wood wouldn't be able to do her job unless she understood what was going on in the conversation. The girl smiled and promised to do her best, because that was indeed the case. After the lesson, she couldn't understand anything, and everything she'd heard seemed to have vanished from her mind. The lesson ended late, and she felt like she hadn't had time to understand every word. She was very upset, eager to get to her bedroom to be alone and recuperate after a stressful day. Suddenly, Sir Jorge said she'd done a very good job today. However, the heroine didn't share this opinion, as her work was simply part of her duties. She decided to ask for separate lessons, but the gentleman did not understand her request, not realizing that she wanted to work on herself and study something outside of the general classes. The lady explained that she wanted to take extra lessons to study independently. She felt as if she could influence the prince's education. He replied that it wouldn't be difficult to find another teacher for that. But there was one point he considered important. People should always be close to the prince. Suddenly, he had a brilliant idea. An entrance ticket to the library, which was always open. The lights were always on, and she could come in any time to read books. She was a little confused and didn't know how to respond to his proposal. Her thoughts filled her, and she sank into contemplation, not entirely sure of her decision. He explained that the library had many more books than her office. She could easily find suitable materials. Hearing this, she relaxed and agreed. One of the subjects the prince was taught was ball control. The teacher asked him to use wider movements, as his technique was flawed. After the young man fulfilled the teacher's request, the teacher praised him for his efforts and told him to repeat the exercise 10 more times to improve his technique. Meanwhile, the protagonist, standing to the side, watched the young man's diligent work. She saw how tirelessly he trained, despite his fatigue. After several strenuous swings of the sword, the young man was very exhausted, and, barely holding back his strength, he continued training, fixated on one point in the air. The teacher, watching this, couldn't understand why he hadn't thought to teach the prince how to handle a ball earlier. After all, Mikhail clearly couldn't sit quietly in the library. The situation was understandable. Jorge knew his father, who was exactly the same. He couldn't sit still and was always eager to take action. However, the main character understood that Mikhail realized that it was impossible to rule the entire world with just one sword, and that more was needed to achieve success. Thanks to the techniques taught to him by Sir Jorge, Mikhail will one day be capable of destroying countless people. These lessons will give him not only strength but also determination. The training, despite its intensity, left the boy thoroughly exhausted. He went to bed earlier than usual, completely exhausted but satisfied with what he had accomplished. When the girl saw that he had fallen asleep, she decided it was time to go to the library. She knew that her time now belonged to knowledge. Sir Jorge, noticing her intentions, wished her luck. He understood that for her, this was more than just a visit to the library, but a chance to develop and be useful. 3 months had passed since Adriana became Mikhail's companion. Her role had changed, and she increasingly preferred to devote herself to books rather than to restless activities. During this period, she decided she was no one important, just the prince's translator. However, for her, this was much more significant than it seemed. Even though those around her didn't understand the meaning of the word, every time she called herself that, it seemed like she was clearly aware of her role in the mansion. To cope with her work, she needed to learn more about makeup, but this proved no easy task. Mikhail's abilities always amazed Professor Schubert. When Mikhail explained something, Adriana couldn't always understand what exactly he meant. Fortunately, the professor soon realized the cause of her confusion. Despite all the difficulties, Adriana continued her studies, although at times she wanted to give up and quit. But fortunately, she was able to overcome this and continue working. She was content to study independently. As if she had had a mentor, her funds would have quickly run out. Working on her own initiative was much more profitable. She soon began thinking about politics and planned to delve deeply into its study, even if it meant sleepless nights. She was willing to do anything to succeed. Suddenly, she heard a voice very close by. It interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see who was calling her. She saw Mikhail standing in front of her with a smile on his face, and it seemed like he wanted to tell her something. She did not immediately understand what had happened, and as always, she turned to him, using a phrase from their usual communication, which he knew very well from her manner of communication. She immediately asked what he was doing there, because it was clear that he needed to hurry and return to his bedroom, where he was supposed to rest. But the boy only responded by saying the name Orchid, which seemed to mean that he simply missed her and wanted to see her as soon as possible. Adriana replied that if he wanted to see her, he should wait until the morning, since she never told him what she was doing in the library. The boy answered again, saying the name Orchid, which again meant that he missed her very much, but they would only be able to meet when the morning came. She couldn't understand where the guards were looking, because instead of watching the boy and not allowing him to leave the bedroom, they did not interfere with her studies. How could he have slipped past such strict security? She couldn't understand how it was possible that no one had noticed his approach to the library. Suddenly, the boy said that he was a wizard, and probably meant to say that he used magic or trickery to pass unnoticed. The lady was not satisfied with this. She took him firmly by the hand and led him home, convincing him that he should sleep until the morning, while she herself would continue her studies. Adriana couldn't understand how he'd managed to pull off such a trick at such a young age. It seemed incredible, as his age wouldn't have allowed him to be so agile and cunning. She thought perhaps he had deceived them because he wanted to see her, because she could feel his longing for her. But did he have the power to change the future? Adriana believed she could help him change his path, but with each passing day, her confidence faded. More and more doubts lingered in her heart, and hope faded. Finally, she reached the room, tired and out of breath. She apologized, asking for a little rest as her breathing was ragged and her strength was exhausted. The boy stood motionless, his gaze fixed on one spot. He seemed absorbed in his thoughts, oblivious to time and the world around him. When the lady addressed him, he didn't immediately respond. His gaze was distant, and his answer was incomplete, as if he were lost in deep thought. She asked him what had happened and why he was staring at the moon so intently. Perhaps there was a reason for his intense attention, but his answer was just one word, The boy spoke of the moment they first met and the brooch he'd given her. He said she was lost, and his words were filled with regret. She remembered it too late and was stunned by how she could have forgotten. It seemed like a momentous occasion, and she immediately began apologizing, because for her it was no small thing. But the boy smiled and said, "Rope." She didn't understand what that had to do with the future, but something in his words made her wonder about the difference it would make. She smiled back and realized she simply needed to be near him. Perhaps if she spent a few years with him, his heart would become less cold and more open. She hoped that her actions to protect him would lead to better consequences than those that might have occurred without her intervention and care. At that moment, her only hope was herself. She decided to do everything in her power to protect Mikkel and help him grow into a worthy man, despite his past. Tired after long hours spent in the library, she fell asleep early. She spent the entire day studying books, hoping to find answers to the questions that tormented her. Suddenly, a maid rushed into the room and began hurriedly waking her. The girl was confused, not understanding what had happened or why she had been awakened so early. The maid told him that Mikkel had finally received an invitation to a ball to be held at the Imperial Palace. This was a momentous event that would change everything. Confused, she learned that Mikkel had never attended an imperial ball before. She asked when it would take place, and the maid replied that it would be in 10 days. The woman clarified that they still had time to prepare. The ball, it turned out, was an important event, and they had a few days to complete all the necessary work. This meant she'd have to act as a floor translator again, which made her life even more difficult. Adriana didn't like the prospect of being forced into that role again. She asked the maid if Sir Jorge had sent her the new schedule. However, as soon as he learned of the change, he immediately informed them. The maid assured them that there was no need to rush now, and perhaps they should calmly prepare for the ball. But something in her soul told her that this day would be difficult. At this point, the maid asked if Adriana would like to hear about a secret method that might help her cope with the upcoming events. She leaned closer and added that she was in the same position, which brought her even closer to the heroine, creating a sense of mutual understanding. Adriana immediately understood the meaning of her words. If she maintained this positive attitude, things would become even more difficult for her. Her simplicity and approachability made her beloved in the house. Adriana smiled and replied that she liked Ashley very much too. The maid was sincere and simple, and this added warmth to the atmosphere of their conversation. A few minutes later, a pleased Sir Jorge knocked on the door, his face beaming with joy. He asked if the girl had heard the latest news. Adriana smiled and replied that she already knew everything. She was up to date on the latest developments, and it made her happy that she'd managed to find out in time. Jorge was delighted by the news. He was happy, and it was all thanks to Adriana, her actions and determination. The main character felt a slight uneasiness, but Sir Jorge calmly told her that all worries should be left to the adults and that she should focus on herself and the prince. Despite Jorge's words, Adriana was still worried. The prince didn't seem happy about what was happening. She couldn't figure out how things would develop next or what he was planning. Jorge assured her that the emperor had already taken care of all aspects, including the princess's weaknesses. He added that it would soon be officially announced and everyone would know the truth. Adriana was terrified and asked Sir Jorge not to joke about it anymore. However, he restrained himself and replied that it was no joke at all, but a real situation. She responded by stating that without her participation, the emperor would not have made such an important decision. Otherwise, Prince Michael would have found himself in an extremely awkward position, made to look like a fool. Now, with Adriana's arrival, the situation has changed. Everyone will soon learn that Prince Mikhail simply has an unusual style of speech, and his role at the ball will be crucial. She must prepare. Sir Jorge couldn't help but be pleased that Kel, despite everything, had at least received some recognition. It reminded her of moments in the past when she'd longed for even the slightest praise from her family. The image of her gathering blades of grass came back to her, thinking that perhaps it had been even harder for him than it had been for her. He was likely experiencing similar feelings. There's only one reason why the prince was finally invited to the ball and allowed to make his appearance. As a result, the room became more filled with intelligence than anyone expected. After she became a translator, Kel seemed to change. He became a completely different person. And now he was able to handle many tasks, which was a great achievement. The rumors had obviously reached the emperor, who perhaps now sought to completely subjugate the prince, turning him into his puppet. The girl felt helpless, which became increasingly alarming. Perhaps it would be better for him if no one knew of his true abilities. Then people would see him as a serious flaw, and he would be unable to claim the throne. Adriana Woods knew that if she truly wanted to stop Mikhail from becoming a cruel tyrant, she had to make every effort to ensure that his bright seed was not destroyed from the very beginning. A feeling of sadness overwhelmed her, for she faced a crucial choice. She understood that now all her strength must be directed toward helping Mikhail navigate this path successfully. Madame Flores, the dance teacher, took charge of preparing the girl for the ball. She asked her what she thought of the event, as Adriana had almost fallen again. Adriana apologized for her blunder, but deep down, she knew there was no easy way out of this situation. She knew she had to learn to dance. Sir Jorge said it would be much wiser for her to learn to dance. It would help her in any case, even if she didn't feel confident at the ball. Adriana replied that she couldn't do it, and to her surprise, the knight added that she simply didn't know how. That's why he hired an experienced dance tutor for her. Adriana felt so lowly that she couldn't even properly place her hand on her partner's shoulder. The question arose, why teach her this if she couldn't dance properly? She received a reply that it might not happen right now, but in the future she would definitely be able to dance peacefully. It sounded like a promise. Nevertheless, she agreed and focused on positive thoughts. She needed to be with His Highness, and besides, these were free dance lessons. When she spotted him, she knew he was incredible. She asked him if he'd be interested in watching her practice, and when he responded positively, it confirmed that she enjoyed it too. Mr. Jorge asked Madame Flores to pair Miss Woods and the prince. It seemed like a great idea, and soon they began dancing. She was surprised she hadn't thought of it before. They were a perfect height match, and dancing with a real partner would have been much more effective. Moreover, dancing with a real partner could significantly improve their skills than constantly pretending to be partners, which would be less productive. She didn't quite understand why this was necessary, however, but Jorge added that it was necessary for Prince Michael, which added seriousness to the whole thing. The emperor announced that he would introduce the prince's partner at the ball. It would likely be a young lady his age, so she should prepare to dance with the prince. Adriana Woods had repeatedly convinced herself not to give in to the boy's naive and angelic gaze. However, finding herself in another unpleasant situation, she realized it would lead to nothing good. The boy, who had rarely smiled before, now beamed like never before. Adriana realized that these thoughts and reflections were of no use, and that she should simply act. She decided not to waste time worrying and got down to business. To the gentle sound of the piano, she began teaching the boy to dance. However, things didn't go according to plan. She kept stepping on his feet and apologizing every time. Adriana couldn't even count how many times she stepped on his feet in half an hour. It happened so often that she couldn't react quickly, and her anxiety grew. She couldn't help but ask him if his legs were okay. Adriana was worried that they might swell from such constant blows, and the boy would end up in pain. She worried that the boy might become upset and stop dancing, but he only quietly uttered one word: tree. This answer reassured her. He felt no pain and wanted to continue practicing. However, when Jorge, as always, intervened and asked what was going on, Adriana, deciding not to worry him, lied. She said the boy was in pain and didn't want to continue dancing, but Sir Jorge immediately sensed the lie and asked if she wanted to terminate the contract. His questions were direct, and his gaze was insistent, like that of an experienced man. At that moment, she realized she had no choice but to learn to dance. So she explained that the tree meant it didn't hurt when someone stepped on it. Even Mr. Jorge began to understand the boy's language, since the word strawberry meant the lady had answered correctly. With every gesture, it became clear. He knew a lot, and despite several failed attempts, she seemed to have finally mastered the art of dancing. It was a difficult challenge, but she grew more confident with each step. But then, just a second later, she stepped on the boy's foot again. The feeling of discomfort returned, but she didn't give up, hoping that everything would work out next time. She admitted she couldn't continue because she didn't want to leave bruises on the prince's legs. This worried her, as she already felt responsible for his well-being. But the prince's body was unharmed, and even the dance teacher noticed. She added that Miss Woods shouldn't worry, as the woolen boots would protect the prince. Sir Jorge said that if it bothered her so much, then she should learn to dance as quickly as possible so as not to harm His Highness and not bother him anymore. This devastated her even more, as she had planned to run away from this assignment. But now it seemed inevitable and she had to complete it. After going through such a difficult ordeal, she finally decided it was worth going to the library. However, at the last moment, she changed her mind and didn't go. The main character declared she was too tired, Sir Jorge noticed she was trying to tell him something, and this couldn't help but draw his attention to her condition. Deep down, she decided he shouldn't be afraid, since her demands were quite fair. It was this feeling that gave her confidence in her actions. She dreamed of getting back the lion-shaped brooch that had been taken from her. It was a gift that meant a lot to her, and she hoped she could get it back. The protagonist wanted the brooch back because it was a gift from the prince himself. She sensed he hoped she would wear it to the ball, which gave her confidence. The boy wasn't sure how to take her words. He didn't know how much to trust them. In response, she merely informed him that he understood everything perfectly well. Something about this conversation apparently didn't sit well with him. The girl noticed and was deeply distressed. Her face betrayed her concern, as his mood had clearly worsened. He asked if she knew what the request was. She explained that it was a very valuable brooch, worth a fortune, and that she couldn't have earned it in her entire life. The brooch, she said, was the last symbol of the imperial family that belonged to His Highness before he became crown prince. It was so important. Jorge explained that he inherited it after his father's death. He noted that if a girl had appeared in the capital with this brooch and claimed to be from the imperial family, she would have been believed. Hearing this, the girl was stunned. How could such a valuable thing have ended up in her possession? Perhaps the prince didn't know its value when he gave it to her, but now he probably guesses. Mr. Jorge remained silent, unsure what exactly she wanted or why she was asking for her back at that moment. He was perplexed and unsure what to do. He didn't know how to explain his feelings, as he himself was at a loss. He couldn't understand what exactly had prompted her to ask him about this now. After a few minutes of explanation and storytelling, Mr. Jorge finally understood what was being discussed. He realized there was a hidden meaning behind the request. As they walked down the hallway, the lady asked if Mr. Jorge had ever thought they might do something bad. But in fact, he was thinking of something completely different. He kept wondering why she didn't want to return the brooch. This question haunted him, because he sensed something more was hidden. Jorge seemed certain that Adriana had only just realized the brooch's true value. But if he doubted her intentions, then he believed she had no place in this house. But to his surprise, he answered something she hadn't expected at all. He said she'd kept the brooch very carefully, and that shocked her. Her face expressed obvious confusion, and then Jorge, noticing this, asked if she had forgotten what had happened in the Baron's house. His question caught her off guard. It was then that she realized she wanted the brooch back, making desperate attempts to get it back. Her intentions became clear. He asked what had changed since then, expecting the girl to immediately ask for the brooch back. What she heard shocked her, as she couldn't understand how she could have forgotten about it. She began to wonder why she hadn't really noticed the brooch, and why she had forgotten about it. It wasn't like her, and the question tormented her. Her explanation might have seemed absurd, but she decided to be frank. She admitted that she had simply forgotten about it despite its significance. He also said that despite her ignorance and indifference, he could not understand how one could forget such a treasure as the imperial family brooch, which is of great value. She replied that too many things had happened, and that they had altered her perception. But for Jorge, that wasn't a sufficient answer. He still couldn't understand how it had happened. However, she herself couldn't understand how she had forgotten about this brooch, which she had always treasured so much. It was completely absurd, especially after everything that had happened to her. After a moment's thought, Jorge noticed that the girl seemed ready to give him an answer. He sensed she was about to explain why forgetting that brooch was so significant. She admitted that she truly treasured this brooch because it was the one Mikhail had given her. Every time she was going through a tough time, she picked it up, remembering the day she met him. During the most difficult moments of her life, Adriana couldn't find anyone to support her. Only Mikhail remained by her side, ready to help in any situation. She always had this piece of jewelry with her, and it seemed she sensed its presence. But Mr. Jorge was certain she didn't need it now. The memory of the brooch only came to her mind after the mention of His Highness. Adriana confirmed that it was indeed so, and decided to accept the gift. After this heartfelt conversation, the knight finally gave up the brooch. He asked the girl to wear it to the ball. Believing she deserved the attention, the girl silently observed the jewelry, pondering it. Mr. Jorge replied that she couldn't remain in the shadows forever, as the brooch symbolized her status. He added that she should be proud of this decoration, because it would be proof of her status, even if she did not yet feel her importance. Suddenly, Adriana understood. From the day she met Mikhail until her last day in the house, this brooch had been her only companion in difficult times. Despite all the pity that might come from her appearance, she would be forced to force those around her to treat her as part of the imperial family. No matter how low her status, everyone around her, including the highest nobility, will bow down before her, recognizing her importance despite her origin. She thanked Mr. Jorge for returning the brooch, but despite her gratitude, she still had no intention of wearing it to the ball. The piece was too significant. Jorge, trying to understand her decision, asked why she wasn't going to wear the brooch. His voice was soft, but his question conveyed genuine concern. She replied that she didn't want to remain by His Highness's side forever. Her words were full of determination, and they betrayed a hint of anxiety about the future. She believed that if she accepted the gift, she would be obligated to accompany him at all times. However, Jorge assured her that this was not the case. He added that she could terminate the contract at any time. But she asked him to stop joking because, she said, even if she quit her job, it wouldn't matter all that much in light of everything that was happening. The situation seemed no less confusing. She added to His Highness that if she appeared with this brooch at any social event, the agreement would immediately become null and void. Everything could change in an instant. For her, it wasn't just jewelry. The brooch was a gift from Mikhail, but its meaning was much deeper. It was a symbol of belonging to a great family, and she felt the weight of responsibility. The brooch had long been the crown prince's signature symbol. She wasn't sure she could bear such a weight, such a responsibility, and was ready to give it up. She added that it would be better to remain anonymous than to be forever tied to him. This was her personal position, and she wasn't afraid to express her thoughts openly. Jorge bowed his head, taking her words in with respect. He understood what she was saying and, to her surprise, agreed with her. He seemed a little upset, which probably made him want to retreat into the shadows to escape public view and calm down. It was understandable in such a situation. The main character could no longer concentrate on what was happening. Her thoughts were confused, and the only thing she wanted was to go to bed as quickly as possible and forget. According to Ashley, after the title was transferred to Mikhail, the imperial ball was held only 6 times, and it became an integral part of life in their circle. However, although His Highness could not attend these events, his age was not a valid excuse, although it did not matter much at the time. The reason was that Mikhail hadn't received an invitation, which surprised the protagonist. She was tormented by unpleasant premonitions, but she couldn't understand why this had happened. Ashley tried to reassure her, assuring her not to worry, but doubts remained. Fear of a possible mistake overcame her, and the maid shared a secret. The maid revealed that perhaps those attending the ball had no idea how significant Adriana was. This revelation came as a surprise to the protagonist. Ashley advised her to simply put herself out there a little, and everyone around her would surely be amazed. Adriana wondered how important such a step might be for her. The main character asked what this whole secret was, to which the maid replied that it was much deeper than it might seem at first glance. Adriana felt delighted at hearing such advice. She was genuinely grateful to have met such a good assistant. The meeting seemed opportune and timely. Since this was her unofficial debut, Adriana could afford to be understated. Quiet modesty would become her signature style that day. This is exactly how Adriana planned to proceed. She chose this approach to avoid drawing attention to herself. Everything had to be delicate and in moderation. This was the perfect option for her. This way, she could look quite dignified, but without attracting too many unwanted glances along the way. She was pleased to hear such words. Adriana urged the girl to be confident, reminding her that she herself was an example of the ideal mistress. Today was one of those days when Adriana didn't have to wait outside Mikhail's bedroom. She decided not to waste time and quietly sneak into the ballroom, having prepared herself in advance. At that moment, she decided to approach the prince when he entered the hall. He wanted them to appear together, and Adriana couldn't deny him this wish. However, she understood that she shouldn't indulge her child's every whim. Such behavior would be too difficult for her and would interfere with her plans. Adriana grew increasingly anxious. She simply needed to blend in with the crowd, but her thoughts wouldn't let go, and she couldn't shake the worries that filled her mind. Suddenly, a woman approached Adriana and politely asked her name, as such a young girl couldn't possibly be here without an older person's supervision. Her gaze was wary. The woman added that she'd been watching Adriana and noticed her pacing back and forth for half an hour. She suggested that Adriana's parents might be lost somewhere nearby. Adriana calmly replied that everything was fine and thanked the stranger for her concern. She was trying not to cause any unnecessary problems or attract unnecessary attention. However, the woman spoke again, insisting that if Adriana had come here secretly, she still had time to return. This statement clearly put the girl in an awkward position. She added that the atmosphere in the house had been tense lately, and even her family could have been in danger. However, Adriana had arrived early to observe the mood. Adriana had no intention of engaging in further conversation and didn't know what to say. She remained silent, hoping the situation would calm down. However, her silence only heightened the woman's suspicions, and she decided to escort her to the exit. Adriana tried to explain that she had been invited to the event, but she needed to show the invitation. At that moment, she felt the importance of not embarrassing herself. Only now did she realize she was missing the vital item she needed. Without it, the situation became much more difficult, and she felt it firsthand. If she had worn a brooch, all these problems could have been easily solved. With this accessory, she could safely navigate even the most difficult moments. The Baron's help wouldn't help here either. Even he couldn't cross the threshold of the palace, and the situation was becoming increasingly tense as time pressed. If she mentioned the Baron here, it would immediately arouse a host of suspicions. This could only complicate her situation. Suddenly, the announcement of His Highness, Mikhail Sonnet de Brant's arrival, rang out. The event caught everyone's attention, and she felt everything change. It was at that moment that the girl decided she wouldn't have another chance. She needed to act quickly before her attention was focused elsewhere. While the lady was distracted, she quietly turned around and began to move quickly in the opposite direction, hoping that no one would notice her. The lady tried to stop her, shouting and asking her to come back, but she was determined, believing it was easier to disappear into the crowd than to remain visible. She decided to disappear among the crowd, hoping she wouldn't be found quickly. At that moment, her only chance was anonymity. Until His Majesty appeared, everyone began discussing the Crown Prince's arrival. This distracted attention from her disappearance and gave her the opportunity to slip away. Everyone present was shocked. Rumors circulating about the boy claimed he was completely out of his mind and looked extremely strange and terrifying. This was alarming. However, one of the gentlemen replied that, despite his appearance, the boy turned out to be quite stupid. He did not give up hope that he would still learn something. However, no one could believe it, and only the young lady overheard this conversation. She, unlike the others, did not believe the emperor would make him crown prince. However, there was likely a reason for this, and perhaps soon these same people will begin discussing Mikhail's innate talents. This could have been part of the plan. The main character waited a long time for the boy's arrival, because that was when she could finally play her role. Her entire plan depended on this moment. Suddenly, she noticed something strange happening around her. The atmosphere had changed, and she felt that not everything was as it should be. A full hour had passed since Mikhail's arrival, and no one had called her. This alarmed the heroine, as delays never boded well. His Majesty was clearly late today, which greatly surprised the main character. She couldn't understand the reason for such uncharacteristic behavior. Moreover, this was the boy's first time attending a ball. Everything was too unusual to avoid causing concern for everyone involved. The ladies began to regret inviting the prince. It became increasingly clear that it would have been better if he had declined to attend the event. Adriana and Sir Jorge knew they had only to follow the emperor's predetermined plan. They could change nothing until His Majesty arrived. Time continued to tick by, but everyone was absorbed in anticipation. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense, and no one knew when the wait would end. Despite the fact that it was called a vow, the orchestra sat in its places, awaiting the signal. They weren't playing, just waiting for the moment when they could begin. Silence reigned in the hall. No one dared express dissatisfaction. Even the Grand Duke Kyle's relatives, who wielded considerable influence, did not allow themselves to do so. Time passed, and the girl couldn't tell exactly how much had passed. Finally, a messenger arrived with instructions, and the situation began to clear up. His Majesty was unable to attend the ball due to ill health. Mr. Jorge then inquired whether the event should continue because of this. The envoy replied that His Majesty would consider it disrespectful if the guests continued to wait. Therefore, the rest was now up to the Crown Prince. From the very beginning, Adriana knew something was wrong. Even the moment the prince didn't show up, she sensed something wasn't working out. But now it was too late. Jorge had completely accepted what was happening, leaving everything as is. Jorge turned to Mikhail, his words firm and confident. This was necessary to keep the situation under control, as the future depended on his actions. And now, finally, the moment had arrived for Adriana herself to intervene. The situation had become so convoluted that nothing could have gotten any worse. It became clear to her that this was precisely what the emperor had been aiming for: total confusion and disorientation. The emperor wanted to make the little prince look like a fool, to make him a laughingstock at the ball. The original plan was for Mikhail to speak up and admit that his mind was retarded and his speech was not developing properly. But now everything was in Adriana's hands. She stood at a crossroads, and the entire future course of events depended on her decisions. Only she could change what was happening, reverse the entire outcome. After Adriana intervened, she had to confirm the truth surrounding Mikhail. The aristocrats began whispering, noticing that no one around them had attempted to intervene, and Ilya, without even taking a single step, remained on the sidelines. Moreover, he didn't even try to talk to his closest ally, Jorge. And to say now that only she understands the prince would seem like an inappropriate lie, completely inappropriate for this situation. The emperor decided to portray Mikhail as a fool and Sir Jorge as a fraud. The plan was perfectly logical, as it would help remove them from the palace and consolidate his power. Suddenly, the heroine realized that the target of this plan was Jorge himself. The palace had long treated him like a fool, but he was far from what everyone thought. If Jorge is branded a fraud, blamed for the crown prince's idiocy, his reputation will be ruined. He'll lose his job. All of this confused her. Perhaps the information about the emperor's plans had already been mentioned in the book, and all of this was just a temporary difficulty that needed to be overcome. He couldn't afford to fail. He had to find a way to overcome this crisis, and he would do so. Otherwise, he would lose everything, including his credibility and his position. At that moment, the envoy announced that His Majesty had ordered Mikhail to forget all his difficulties. Jorge looked at the young man, hoping for a response, but he remained silent. Mikhail didn't know what to answer. He remained silent and simply waited for instructions, not daring to break the silence, including in front of his advisor. The knight announced that the young man would be taking charge of the ball and asked if he was confident he could handle the responsibility. The boy was unprepared for this turn of events, and his face betrayed his confusion. It was clear the young man was starting to get nervous. He was clearly nervous, unsure of what to do next or how to proceed. His indecision was obvious, and he didn't know how to get out of this situation. Mr. Jorge said the boy would succeed. He also added that Lady Adriana would arrive soon, which, in his opinion, would ease the situation and provide the necessary support for further action. The young man began to blame himself for failing to plan everything perfectly. He worried that the situation could now spiral out of control, and that everything might go completely wrong. At that moment, Adriana approached and addressed the knight. She was calm, despite the tension of the situation, and this somewhat reassured those around her, although the knight himself remained uneasy. The knight was glad to see her, but his anxiety only grew. His worries grew, and it seemed to him that her presence was no longer able to change the course of events, despite the fact that he was still glad she had arrived. The knight believed they were already caught in a trap laid by His Majesty. Adriana's presence, he felt, could no longer have the desired effect on what was happening. However, despite his pessimism, he couldn't understand why her appearance had brought a sense of calm to his face. At that moment, he suddenly heard a strange voice, which surprised him even more. A young man in uniform was approaching them. His approach piqued the knight's interest, as he clearly hadn't expected to encounter him in such a place and at such a crucial moment. It was Duke Ilyapur. His presence caused no small surprise among everyone, as his appearance here was far from expected. This only added to the mystery of the proceedings. Sir Jorge was greatly surprised. He had never expected the Duke to be in this place, and he was surprised that such an important person would be there, right now, in the midst of such a tense situation. The Duke asked to be addressed less formally, as Mr. Jorge was his only uncle. He asked to be called Ilya, as he had been in the days of their more casual encounters. The knight merely twisted his mouth and said nothing in response. His face expressed displeasure or confusion, but he didn't voice his emotions, preferring silence. Having not seen each other for a long time, the Duke greeted Jorge and someone else present. His greeting was polite, but there was a hint of heaviness in his voice, likely due to the unrest that lay ahead. The young man couldn't answer. He sat silently, and it was clear he wasn't enjoying the meeting. His face was slightly sad, and his mood remained subdued, perhaps due to everything that had happened. Ilya immediately approached his uncle to ask if the rumors about the boy's stupidity were true. He was concerned, as they could influence how society perceived the boy. However, the knight replied with a smile that this was all just an exaggeration, as His Highness was simply a little nervous before his first ball. It was his first experience, and such worries were quite natural for a young heir. Although he had been hosting balls since he was 9 years old, Ilya noted that each case is unique. In this case, many factors come into play, and it's unlikely the young prince could have mastered all the nuances of such an important event right away. Ilya added that he would try to find a way to help the boy cope with the situation and overcome his fears. He was confident that with support and guidance, the prince could become a worthy heir. Jorge, reflecting on this, wondered if he had finally severed ties with the family, but his older brother couldn't let him go so easily. Perhaps the whole situation had been staged to bring him back into the family. Despite being bitten by a snake that turned out to be dead, Jorge was certain death wouldn't come so easily. He knew he had to fight for his place in the world and maintain his dignity despite the difficulties. No one present could have imagined that Sir Jorge, the Duke's uncle, was actually involved in such a complex and intricate affair. He remained in the shadows, but his influence was far from insignificant. His name was constantly mentioned in class, which created an uneasy feeling in the girl. She was already beginning to realize that everything that was happening was connected to his attempts to bring Jorge back into the ducal family, and she didn't like that. Even despite her inexperience, the girl began to suspect that all these manipulations and events were planned solely with the goal of returning Jorge to his former position and place in the family hierarchy. Sir Jorge faced a difficult choice, one that might be the only right decision for his survival. His answer would determine not only his fate, but also the fate of those around him at that moment. By refusing the offer, he risked losing not only his reputation, but also his life. This choice was too important, and the consequences could have been catastrophic for him personally. By accepting the Duke's offer, Sir Jorge would have risked not only his own life, but also that of Adriana and even little Mikhail. The decision he made was very difficult for everyone. However, despite all the danger, such an outcome seemed far better than the death of everyone without exception. Sir Jorge understood that it was the least worst of all possible solutions. Perhaps at some point he sensed that the ducal family, no matter how hard they tried, would not be able to overcome this challenge without his help. He believed his decision would, to some extent, save the situation. But suddenly Jorge responded that he didn't need the offer at all. This came as a complete surprise, especially to the girl who hadn't expected such a turn of events. She realized there was no way to persuade him, and she realized her powers were helpless in this situation. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat, unsure how to respond to his decision. At that moment, Jorge, with a smile on his face, knelt down, further surprising those around him. His actions were completely unpredictable and caused confusion among everyone nearby. Everyone present was shocked by this gesture. It was completely different from what they expected from him in such a tense situation. Their surprise never left them. When Jorge, unexpectedly to everyone, knelt before him, no one understood what he was trying to say. It could mean that he and His Majesty already knew everything, and his crime would not go without consequences. Jorge decided to come clean and confess everything he had been hiding. His decision to lay all his cards on the table could radically change the situation, presenting everyone with a new choice. Duke Ilya was extremely perplexed by what was happening and couldn't understand what exactly was being discussed. He asked that such absurd and incomprehensible remarks not be uttered again, and that he try to bring the situation back to a more reasonable level. However, the knight, unwilling to back down, declared that throughout this entire time he had been deceiving His Majesty the Emperor and manipulating the very essence of the Crown Prince, misleading everyone. He continued that everyone present had probably heard about His Highness's feeble-mindedness, but these were just rumors that the knight himself had spread, trying to create a false impression of what was happening. However, according to him, all this is just empty talk, and in fact, the essence of it is that these rumors were spread by him himself in order to hide the true picture of events. Only now did Adriana begin to realize what was really happening, and it became clear to her that she needed to intervene as quickly as possible to prevent the knight from doing something even more unpredictable, like throwing himself off the cliff. The knight emphasized that the Crown Prince was as intelligent as his father and possessed a keen mind, despite all the rumors. He tried to convince the audience that they were mistaken in their assessments. Until this point, the knight had deliberately concealed the truth, causing the crowd to verge on rage and confusion. He, however, believed that all of this was justified by his personal strategy. He laughed, claiming that the situation was easier than taking candy from a baby, explaining that the Crown Prince did indeed have a speech impediment which could affect how others perceived him. The people were perplexed and couldn't understand the real problem. They didn't expect that this same Sir Jorge, once a knight at court, would find himself involved in such a strange conflict. At this point, the emperor's advisor took the floor and turned to Sir Jorge, asking him if he wished to explain to those present that the young man, in fact, simply could not adequately perceive what was happening. She replied that this didn't mean the boy couldn't speak, but his speech was so complex that only those close to him could understand it. This was alarming, as no one around him knew what this young man was hiding. This statement deeply shocked Adriana. It seemed that Sir Jorge was about to revive the true purpose of the ball, ruined by the emperor. This plan was so important that the very idea was linked to something global, something that could change their destinies. Jorge added that he had managed to win His Highness's favor and capitalize on his trust. He had dared to reveal the potential that had been hidden until now, seizing the opportunity. He noted that it was with this mindset that he approached preparations for today. However, he said that His Majesty had probably already understood everything, and everyone present then became curious about the purpose of his actions. This surprised them, as such a move towards the prince was unusual and raised many questions among the guests. Those present were shocked by his words, as up until this point, he had always demonstrated impeccable loyalty to the crown prince. This behavior was completely at odds with the image they were accustomed to seeing of him and caused genuine bewilderment. He scratched his beard and, despite questions about the purpose of his actions, declared that the essence of this act could be understood by anyone with common sense. This was a hint that everyone should understand what he meant. Finally, he stated outright that his goal was to strip the prince of his title. This statement stunned everyone. They hadn't expected such a turn of events, especially from a man they trusted, considering him a staunch ally. Adriana couldn't understand what exactly Sir Jorge was plotting or how he planned to get out of this situation. It remained a mystery to her, but one thing was clear. Her life was now inevitably bound up with the consequences of these intrigues. Meanwhile, the heroine, Adriana, simply remained silent, unable to comprehend what was happening around her. Her thoughts were clouded, and she couldn't accept the entire situation. She watched the others, feeling completely confused. The entire courtyard was in shock. People chatted among themselves, confused, asking if it was true. They couldn't believe what they were hearing and sought confirmation of this incredible news. Adriana couldn't believe what was happening. Everything seemed pointless and absurd to her, because Crown Prince Mikhail was completely unsuitable for this important role. She believed this position should belong to someone else. The title belonged to a dead man, and her mind couldn't accept the idea that a living person like Mikhail could occupy such a position. It contradicted all her notions of order. Everyone around was stunned. They were amazed at how drastically and unexpectedly everything had changed. This was especially shocking for those who knew Mikhail, who couldn't imagine him as the crown prince. Suddenly, in complete silence, he unexpectedly threw down his sword, a symbol of his strength and will. The gesture was so unexpected that everyone present held their breath, trying to figure out what would happen next. After this, Mikhail turned to His Excellency Duke Ilya, saying they had already made enough noise. He asked if the Duke wanted him to go to prison himself, hinting at the possible consequences. At this point, a young man who witnessed the events, asked the guards to arrest Sir Jorge. But unfortunately, the miracle did not occur, and everything unfolded according to the already predicted scenario. Adriana, filled with pity and compassion for Sir Jorge, wanted to beg the others for mercy, but her words fell on deaf ears as no one paid attention to her pleas. Soon, Sir Jorge was finally arrested. The guards left him no choice but to carry out their orders. It was inevitable, and he ended up in captivity despite the heroine's attempts to intervene. His honor was dishonored before the eyes of countless aristocrats. The entire court watched as his dignity was humiliated, which was extremely painful and shameful for him. Although Adriana couldn't read lips, she could see his expression and understand that he was trying to tell her something. Those last words were important to her, even if she couldn't fully decipher them. She burst into tears because these were the words he always repeated, as if it had become a habit. Such phrases often came from his lips, and each time they proved deeply meaningful to her. They seemed to pierce her heart, causing her to experience them again and again. Everyone was shocked by what had happened and couldn't understand what would happen to His Highness. The situation had become completely unusual, and it seemed there was no simple answer. The time was filled with anxiety and confusion. However, Adriana wasn't worried about what would happen to His Highness, but rather about what would happen to Sir Jorge. He was an important figure to her, and the thought of his possible tragic fate haunted her. Meanwhile, the crown prince sat silently, pondering what was happening. He didn't know what to do or how to react to all these events. His silence wasn't just silence, but a manifestation of helplessness and confusion. Brother Jorge, for his part, was deeply distressed. He decided to help solely to bring him back to the family, unaware that the consequences could be so tragic. This step seemed to be a trial he couldn't have predicted. No one could have foreseen the unexpected turn things would take. Everything went awry, and the situation became so complex that even those closest to the situation couldn't figure out what to do next. He was at a loss, unsure what to do. Sir Jorge was too important to him, and he couldn't imagine living without him. It felt like a great loss, difficult to recover from, no matter what was happening around him. He watched all this, aware that new gossip had begun to circulate among people. Everyone now had their own opinion, and everyone was trying to interpret what had happened in their own way. All this created an atmosphere of tension and mistrust. He decided to imagine that everything that was happening was insignificant, as if he didn't exist in this situation. This allowed him to temporarily free himself from the feeling of heaviness and ease his condition at least a little. Although he failed to fully achieve his goal, he nevertheless complied with the imperial family's demands. This was his only chance to maintain his position and avoid ending up in an unfavorable situation where he could lose everything. The emperor issued strict orders to isolate the crown prince as much as possible. His abilities were too great, raising concerns that his talent could pose a threat to his power. From that time on, rumors began to circulate in the palace that the crown prince, contrary to all expectations, was significantly smarter than he might first appear. These rumors forced many to reconsider their opinions of him. The emperor will never make concessions to those whose actions run counter to his plans. Therefore, no one doubted that Mr. Jorge would be unlikely to emerge from this situation to his own advantage or that of others. Nevertheless, despite all the obstacles, the last prince, like everyone else, will receive his title directly from the emperor. He remains a valuable tool, albeit not in the best position, and can be used for certain purposes. The emperor intends to announce to the entire empire that the crown prince is nothing but an idiot, and that even the duke, despite his efforts, will be unable to prevent the prince's downfall. With this step, his plan to eliminate the crown prince will be almost complete. At the ball, among the aristocracy, everyone saw the crown prince as nothing more than a frightened boy, incapable of even standing up for himself. The revelation that one of his confidants was a fraud only added fuel to the fire and improved the emperor's situation. Suddenly, the envoy was summoned to the hall, surprising everyone present, especially the young man. He hadn't expected such a turn of events, and this added to the intrigue. To their surprise, the messenger turned out to be none other than Mikhail, the very same crown prince who had suddenly decided to come to the forefront and show himself, which had greatly changed the course of events in the palace. Even the prince, plucking up his courage, stepped forward and spoke. Adriana Woods believed she could handle it, having rehearsed all her speeches and moves for this important day countless times. Adriana Woods, mustering all her resolve, stepped forward to address the assembled group, decisively taking the initiative. Her confidence in her actions left no room for doubt. She was determined to continue what she had begun. The girl announced that His Highness Michael had not yet concluded the ball and that no one should leave until it was over. This caused some surprise among those present, as everyone was expecting the celebration to end. The boy didn't immediately understand what she meant. He was confused, unable to comprehend what plan she had in mind. He couldn't imagine that her words contained anything more than a simple instruction. However, the girl stood her ground, confident in the correctness of her actions. Her determination and calm left no room for doubt. She was in complete control of the situation. Adriana clarified that this wasn't some kind of trick, as the Duke might have thought. She referred to the recent message from the Emperor's messenger, who had conveyed orders to continue the ball. This came as a surprise to the Duke. She asked whether the Duke would oppose the Emperor's order, which had been conveyed by messenger. This question confused him, as he hadn't expected the girl to stand her ground so resolutely. Sir Jorge, observing the proceedings, immediately noticed that such an outcome could greatly frighten the Duke. He warned that if the girl began to show weakness, His Highness would find himself at a disadvantage. However, the guy couldn't shake the feeling that the girl was over-embellishing the situation. In response to her words, he uttered several dissatisfied phrases, trying to defend his point of view. At the moment the truth began to emerge, it seemed as if everyone had already witnessed the unraveling of this secret affair. As expected, the being called Mikhail turned out to be feeble-minded, but Adriana didn't allow him to continue. She confidently declared the question meaningless, its very essence dissolving like a sound fading into thin air. She held no interest in such a discussion, and she had no intention of delving into the details. The young man turned and, clearly perplexed, asked Adriana about her true identity. He couldn't understand why she was allowing herself to humiliate Duke Perrault, causing him misunderstanding and displeasure. It seemed to him that the lady had completely lost her fear and no longer felt threatened. However, Adriana, not wanting to stop there, continued speaking with restraint but confidence, ignoring his confusion. Gathering her strength and strengthening her resolve, she added that, as Sir Jorge had said, she was one of the few who could understand the true meaning of His Highness's words, and her words were filled with confidence and determination. At that moment, the same woman who had recently tried to kick Adriana out of the ball appeared. She admitted that she had no parents and couldn't say for sure what family she came from, but her appearance changed the course of events. She had immediately decided that the girl had somehow secretly entered the ball, but now it seemed to her that she looked more like the personal servant of the crown prince, which in turn greatly puzzled her. She couldn't understand why, as an aristocrat, the girl had decided to appear at the ball, behaving so brazenly as if completely unaware of her status. The Duke, however, believed she was too young to be a servant. The other girls discussed her among themselves, noting that she looked no older than a child, and most likely had no official title or position, which further increased her uncertainty. The conversation suddenly stopped when the crown prince approached the girl and touched her. The moment left everyone speechless, as his action was unexpected and extremely strange to everyone present. The entire hall froze as the crown prince began to do something that caught everyone's attention. The air grew tense, and the moment itself seemed decisive for what would follow. Showing intimacy in such a situation could hardly help improve her situation. But the crown prince still took this step, despite all the risks and consequences that could follow. He repeated the vague word again, which sounded like foam. The boy was visibly shaking violently, and his condition seemed to be growing increasingly tense, causing concern among those around him. The girl realized she needed to focus on her role, as only she could help Mikhail. She decided she had to be prepared for any eventuality and support him, no matter how difficult it might be. She added that His Highness felt that her words were not worth listening to, although in fact she knew that her support could be decisive for everything that was happening, even if her opinion was not taken seriously. The woman didn't react well to the boy's words, and then he uttered the word stone. Hearing this, the aristocrat began to doubt his meaning and spoke up, questioning his words. Suddenly, the young man uttered the word ball. The word had several meanings, and in this context he most likely meant to refer to Sir Jorge, which could have confused everyone nearby. Bringing up the subject now would certainly not lead to good results. The young man was on the verge of making a profound statement, and any misinterpretation could lead to misunderstandings among those present. But the young man repeated the word sword again, leaving the girl completely confused. She didn't know how to react, as such words could have very serious consequences if misinterpreted. She felt uneasy, because even if she tried to decipher his words incorrectly, it could cause confusion. She understood that no one present would likely understand the true meaning of his words. At that moment, the thought occurred to her that it wouldn't be a big deal if she committed a little deception. She reasoned that her actions concerned only Mikhail, and it wouldn't harm anyone if she did what she thought best. But the girl paused for a moment, realizing that if she brought this up here, the consequences could be dire. She realized that any wrong word or action could lead to serious consequences. Ultimately, she decided she wouldn't do that because she was the only one who could help Mikhail communicate with others. By changing the meaning of his words, she would be betraying him, which would be unacceptable. Veronica Elia felt like everything in her life could fall apart. If even the only person she connected with betrayed her, she might never be able to trust anyone again. This realization weighed heavily on her soul. By then, she would have left him, and, left alone, there would be no one he could confide in. Only Sir Jorge remained the one who truly followed him and never betrayed him. Realizing this, she decided to reveal the truth and said that His Majesty had mentioned Sir Jorge, but added that what she had told Sir Jorge did not in any way reflect the real state of affairs, since this man was not who he was thought to be. She told the nobles that the knight, who supported the working community, always acted in the interests of others. For his loyalty and dedication, the Crown Prince expressed his deep gratitude, placing his example on a pedestal. At one point, the young man uttered the word Kapkan, signaling Ilya's beginning. However, she hastened to add that Sir Jorge's arrest had been unjust, and the prince hoped he would be released immediately before it was too late. It seemed as if these were the last words the young man would ever utter. His voice lacked both resolve and strength. This sense of finality unsettled those present, forcing them to consider their next steps and the consequences. The women standing nearby began to speculate about the origins of the orphan girl Sir Jorge had brought with him. They thought she was simply a commoner, capable of composing well, but nothing more. At least, that's how they imagined her. The look at the girl left no doubt. She looked like a simpleton, dressed in expensive clothes, which contrasted sharply with her demeanor. The women whispered among themselves, not believing she could be anything more than just a chance find of Sir Jorge's. They watched her with distrust, believing her words were merely an attempt to pass them off as His Highness's speech. To them, it was nothing more than a farce, an attempt to conceal the true meaning of what was happening with silly words. Everything seemed forced and artificial. The girl quickly realized the situation was escalating. She knew that if she didn't take action, the consequences could be far more serious than she imagined. Adriana felt a heavy pressure, from which there was no easy way out. To rectify the situation, she needed to clarify. She firmly added that the women were right in their assessment. She really was just a simple orphan, dressed in expensive clothes, and in no way distinguished from the others. She admitted that she had never attended school and therefore hadn't had much of an upbringing. There was a hint of shame in her words, as the life she had led hadn't exactly lived up to high standards. She was her own teacher. She described how she began each morning with household chores, then went into the mountains to gather fresh herbs for her needs. Afterward, she worked around the house until nightfall like a true housewife. For her, it was a familiar routine, nothing special. The girl tried to explain how an ordinary girl like herself could embellish Crown Prince Mikhail's words. After all, if that were the case, her words might be a lie, and he, being intelligent, could easily notice. The Emperor's messenger agreed with her words, noting that Mikhail was indeed not prone to delusions. The Crown Prince had always demonstrated firmness of mind, and in this matter he was completely uninfluenced. Soon the aristocrats began discussing what they had heard. Their opinion of the girl had changed, and her words now sounded much more persuasive. It seemed she could truly be a simple woman, capable of communicating with such a high-ranking person as His Highness. The women couldn't understand how a child of the common people could compose a speech worthy of a highness, and, as if in response to their bewilderment, Duke Ilya glared at them, silencing them. He ordered them to answer if Adriana's words were true, for if so, it would indicate that His Highness possessed intelligence remarkable for a man of his station. However, in his opinion, that was not the case at all. His doubtful gaze showed he didn't believe what he was saying. Ilya believed it was all just empty words, and that the girl perhaps didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a familiar voice rang out. It was so clear and confident that it immediately attracted the attention of everyone present, and many turned their gazes toward the source of the sound. It turned out to be the professor who had been tutoring the boy. She explained that she had spent the last few months studying with His Highness Kale, imparting to him knowledge that now seemed quite profound. This surprised many, as the teacher was among those present at the ball, and no one expected to see him in such a place. This woman's presence was unexpected, and her words made everyone pause. For the girl, surrounded by a crowd, this was a real surprise. She hadn't expected that this woman, famous and respected, would prove to be such an important figure in the boy's education. Everyone present was shocked, for it was Tessa Schuber, a professor at the academy, a person of outstanding knowledge whose name had always commanded respect in high circles. No one had expected her appearance. Tessa Schubert reported that she had taught His Highness politics and history, and within 3 months he had reached such a level that he was in no way inferior to a trained academy student, which came as a complete surprise to everyone. The entire social circle began to whisper, shocked that such a high-ranking person as Tessa was tutoring a boy. Their confusion was understandable, but their surprise remained even after her explanation. Amazingly, the Crown Prince managed to catch up with the Academy's curriculum in just 3 months, which surprised everyone. Ilya, however, wasn't surprised, as he had already been informed of this in advance. He thought they were having some kind of written conversation, but the woman replied that the boy had neither speech nor the ability to write. This opened up new questions about how learning occurs. Ilya, hearing her answer, noted that in that case, the woman could teach the boy anything. He noticed his appearance and, jumping to conclusions, declared that the boy understood everything. The woman, hearing this, replied with restraint that, in her opinion, the Duke was very much mistaken, since, apparently, his ideas about the situation had changed since he had listened to academic lectures. She recalled that the Crown Prince and Miss Woods had just demonstrated how they communicated. and this argument proved no less significant and irrefutable for Ilya. The woman didn't want to continue the conversation with this fool, in her opinion. She turned to leave, but the aristocrats began asking questions, asking if what she had said was true. Then, without hesitation, she declared that she was putting her reputation on the line. Raising her hand to her heart, she confirmed that the young girl was not a servant at all, and everything she had said was true. She emphasized that she completely believed and had no doubt that all the words conveyed to her truly belonged to His Highness, thereby assuring those gathered of the truth of her words. All the women were shocked. The aristocrats were ready to hear anything but this. It was precisely with the help of the professor's research that the Schubert Empire significantly expanded its possessions, so there was no point in her confirming the lie. The women began to confirm these words among themselves, because she was not one of those who would easily intervene in such a situation, because she had no reason to deliberately interfere. But I still couldn't believe it. And then the professor replied that anyone could understand this if they talked to him personally for 3 months. She added that Miss Woods was from the common people and had never attended school, and although she had also attended the lessons, she could not understand even half of them. But no matter what topic she asked His Highness, his answers always sounded insightful. Ilya even guessed a little about the fact that Professor Schubert is so protective of the Crown Prince. This is surprising because the spies clearly reported that she did not even have a hint of sympathy for him. Didn't she become the Crown Prince's teacher only because Jorge was obliged to pay off her enormous debts? Suddenly, everything in Ilya's head fell into place as if a complex puzzle had been assembled. He couldn't help but laugh, loud, harsh, almost defiant. A triumphant gleam came into his eyes, as if he'd just caught someone red-handed and was absolutely certain he'd figured her out. Suddenly, right in the middle of the assembled group, he made a loud announcement. His voice didn't waver, and everyone heard him accuse Adriana of lying. He was confident in himself and his words, leaving no room for doubt in his determination to expose her. Despite the harshness of the accusation, the professor remained calm. She stood firm and confident, not giving in to emotion. Her voice was clear as she asked Ilya to be more careful and mindful of his words, as every word spoken could have consequences. The Duke seemed to remember something important, and squinting, asked if the woman had any debts left after her family's collapse. Adriana responded calmly, without a hint of confusion. She said there was no point in waiting for her to go bankrupt, as no one could afford that. Ilya asked the woman if she still had huge debts after the collapse of her family, and then the woman replied that she was not on the verge of ruin. It was not something that could ruin her. Ilya merely chuckled at this and claimed that Sir Jorge had deliberately gotten close to her. He had allegedly promised to pay off his debts, and that was precisely the reason Adriana had taken the prince's position as tutor, the very same one whom all the respected mentors had already rejected. But she answered again calmly and confidently. Adriana emphasized that His Highness was not the fool they were trying to make him out to be. There was nothing in him that would warrant calling him that. Her voice was sincere and protective, like someone who saw potential in him. And yet, despite her student's defense, she agreed with some of the Duke's words. It sounded like a partial confession, and that was enough for the audience. No one needed more evidence. Everyone seemed to have found confirmation of a long-held opinion. Ilya, without wasting a moment, declared this out loud. He reminded everyone that Schubert herself had revealed the whole truth a month ago. Allegedly because of the debts paid by Sir Jorge, Adriana continued to lie. His words sounded like the final blow, full of venom and certainty. It seemed the entire aristocracy was once again in a state of confusion and mild bewilderment. This unexpected turn of events had upended their routine, upsetting the delicate balance between their pride and their desire to understand. Duke Ilya waited tensely for the professor's answer, his gaze never leaving her. At that moment, he seemed particularly focused, as if he sensed something important was about to happen, and that an explanation could change everything. The woman turned to the prince and, looking at him with restraint, asked if she had made any mistakes while training him. Her voice was confident, but beneath it lay a cold challenge. Then the young man spoke Elbrand's name. It wasn't just a word, it was a sign that he remembered his past, hadn't renounced it, but no longer held a grudge. His voice was firm and almost calm. Elbrand's name became the key to everything, the very meaning she had tried to impart to her lessons. The city had been destroyed long ago, reduced to ashes, and now remained only a lifeless symbol of what was gone. The professor confirmed this. A hint of regret flickered in her eyes. Elbrand had once truly been a significant place, but now its essence had vanished, and with it, its former influence. Then she asked a seemingly simple question. How could a child of common descent know about a place that had vanished 7 centuries ago? The answer was obvious. It was the will of the crown prince himself. Following this, she calmly remarked that the accusations leveled at her had been unfounded. Her words were calm, yet laced with a sense of self-importance. Unexpectedly, the woman asked if the Duke knew how exactly the debt Sir Jorge had agreed to repay had come about. Her tone was almost calm, but behind it lay something much deeper than mere curiosity. Duke Ilya froze. His gaze hardened, his face expressionless. Suddenly, his confidence vanished, and it became clear that what he'd said had touched something deeply personal and painful. He didn't say a word. Panic clearly crossed his face. He seemed to be struggling with an internal storm, unsure how to counter it or what to say to keep things from getting worse. His appearance made it clear he knew the truth and the essence of what had happened. But the professor asked a new question. Why had the young man dared to present everything as if there was something more behind it than mere knowledge?